Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto is no longer the ninja he once after Jiraiya death. If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. The boy looked more like a man with his head down and his back to the sun. Maybe it was the way his short, spiky hair, the color of a burning sunset, cast a shadow over his eyes. Or the way he held his shoulders, as if he was carrying something much heavier than the small canvas pack slung over one shoulder. He wore a simple pair of black pants and a red gi that was reminiscent of a rejected samurai without a sword. His feet were clad in cheap zori, and black arm warmers wrapped around his arms from his wrists to his elbows. All in all, the male figure looked a little worse for wear. The boy was walking down a worn dirt road westward, towards Suna. He wasn't really sure why. He had made a promise to avoid that place the last time he had been there, despite the fact that the case cage had given him express permission to find refuge within the hidden village. But Gaara had known better than any of the others that Akatsuki would look for him anywhere. So, the boy had promised to stay away. And he never went back on his word. A sudden crash from the road ahead of him made the redhead snap his head up, almost violently. Two men in matching half-cloaks blocked the road while the redhead paused calmly and waited. "Give us the pack, boy," one of the men demanded. "You're robbing me?" the redhead muttered, more to himself than to his sudden companions. Bright blue eyes lit up with barely concealed amusement. "Trust me, I don't have anything you're interested in." The tone was a friendly kind of teasing, as if he and the robbers had established a strong enough rapport to give each other a good ribbing. But the boy on the road held his arms slightly away from his sides and his legs bent at the knees, betraying years of training that had taught his muscles the act of deliberately choosing fight over flight. Privately, the traveler wondered if his pack carried any money at all. Still, he wasn't about to give it up. What few contents it carried were necessary to his survival. "For your own good, kid," the shorter robber sneered at the boy. "Just hand over what ya got, and you won't get hurt." The boy in the middle of the road let out a soft scoff and slid his left foot backwards slightly, sinking into a basic taijutsu starting form. The robbers weren't intimidated. Many travelers had at least some basic fighting skills. It was becoming a necessity with all the Nuke Nin running around since the fall of one of the strongest shinobi villages. Hai no Kuri had become more and more lawless in the past year. "Come on, Nero," the taller man yelled confidently. He dashed forward, holding a plain kunai in one hand as he ran. The boy on the road smiled. The men were underestimating him. He could already see their movements clearly, the way their weight shifted each time they took a step. They were Chunin level at best. Nothing he needed to worry about. He ducked under the swing of the kunai and knocked the taller man across the back with his bare fist, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Ichiro," his companion, Nero, called. The would-be victim turned up one half of his mouth into an amused smile. This was going to be easier than he thought. "Bastard." Enraged, Nero let a kunai fly towards the one responsible for his partner's current state. The kunai sailed towards the watching and waiting boy as Ichiro scrambled out of the way. The boy seemed unconcerned as the weapon neared him. He raised one hand and prepared to bat the kunai away before he saw the dark writing wrapped around the handle of the kunai. Eyes widening, the boy switched tactics abruptly. He ran through a series of hand seals, ending by slamming both palms into the packed earth of the well-traveled road. A wall of earth, almost 3 feet thick, shot out of the ground between the boy and the incoming weapon. The kunai landed in the sudden shield with a loud thunk, and all activity paused for the space of one breath. Then the exploding tag attached to the kunai went off, shattering the earthen wall into bits and dust. Ichiro and Katsu stood together in the middle of the road and watched a slight breeze shift the light brown cloud of dust off the road. As the dust cleared, they saw their red-headed victim standing stock still where he had been. The ruined jutsu was at his feet, and his right side was slightly singed. He raised his head and stared at his attackers with eyes the color of blood, knifed down the center with animalistic pupils. His canines were somehow longer and peered beneath his upper lip to give him the appearance of fangs. "That hurt, Yuru," the boy grumbled in a flat voice that didn't match his fiery eyes. Nero bared his teeth at the idiot who refused to die when he was supposed to. "I'll show you hurt," yelled Nero. He pulled another kunai and rushed forward. Ichiro held back slightly, his wide eyes taking in the strange change in the boy's appearance. As his enemy advanced, the boy's hand dove into the small pack that he carried and withdrew a simple scroll. With a quick flip in the air, the scroll landed on the ground, opened to reveal a dark circle of writing surrounding a single kanji. A small nip on the boy's thumb drew enough blood to smear over the paper, running a red line through the black ink. Quickly, as if it were alive, the inked circle spread out from the paper to encompass the boy kneeling on the ground as well as the charging nin. "Brother, don't." Ichiro jerked his companion away from the dark array on the ground. "You know who that is?" The dark-haired Nero frowned at his friend briefly before staring at their victim, like he was trying to place him. "That's Konoha's missing nin," snapped Ichiro, "Uzumaki Naruto." Nero jumped back suddenly, as if the name alone could inflict a fatality. The boy on the road ground his teeth together briefly and rolled up his unused scroll. Their fear could be useful, but that particular piece of information was something he had been trying to hide for the past year. "You must have me confused with someone else," the shinobi once known as Uzumaki Naruto declared calmly. "My name is Keiru." Keiru brought his hands together in front of his chin in a simple cross symbol. With barely a mutter, there were suddenly two red-headed shinobi in the road where one stood previously. "You want to kill me?" one of the identical figures demanded. "I hear Danzo's offering a fat reward by now." The two men facing him didn't charge, but they didn't back down, either. Keiru gritted his teeth behind a disappointed pout. Seemed as if these guys would be harder to get rid of than he initially thought. Which left the initiative to him. Not that he minded. He had never been the patient type. The pout on his lips slowly turned into a confident smile as Keiru and his clone charged. Nero's eyes followed the clone as Ichiro focused on the original body, both ready for one-on-one combat. Too bad they weren't dealing with a one-on-one kinda guy. Keiru stopped short of the two robbers and planted his feet. The clone jumped up, stepping on the redhead's back and launching himself into the air. At the peak of his leap, the flying ninja brought his fingers together and split suddenly into two with a mere puff of smoke. The two figures sailed downward towards Nero, while the boy on the ground quickly dropped and swept one leg towards Ichiro's feet as the older robber stared up at the display of mid-air ninjutsu. Ichiro was lucky enough to regain his composure just in time to see Keiru's leg and jump out of the way. Nero raised one hand to catch a descending punch, but he missed the heel that slammed into his shoulder, sending him to his knees. "Brother!" Ichiro shouted around Keiru. One of the clones chopped the back of his opponent's neck to send Nero into a quick coma. At least, that was the intention. Keiru didn't really plan on an avenging brother. Ichiro pulled out a katana from his belt. It was short, about the length of the standard blades that Enbu always carried around. Rage-filled eyes glared at Keiru, and he seriously considered making a few more clones just for insurance. Keiru brought his hands up and opened his mouth to call out his favored jutsu again, but he was forced to duck before he could utter the words. As the blade sailed over his head, Keiru received a sudden memory of stabbing. One of his clones had just been dispelled on Ichiro's backswing. Great, now he was facing a relatively good swordsman instead of just a robber with some ninja skills. Perfect. Keiru fell into a crouch, one knee touching the ground as he tensed, ready to spring back into action. Suddenly, a sharp pain penetrated his abdomen, beginning at the center of his navel and spreading to encase him like wildfire. Keiru arched his back so sharply that he thought his spine was about to snap. He barely registered his last clone dispelling, the pain in his stomach was too strong for him to think. Then, he registered a second type of pain. He had just been stabbed. It was a strange feeling, the metal of a blade still buried in his back, warming itself with his blood. Dazed, he turned his head to glance behind him. The taller of his opponents, Ichiro, was staring at him with wide eyes, still holding the hilt of his katana. Keiru must have made a weird picture, fighting splendidly 1 minute and then doubled over in pain the next. But Ichiro's wide eyes weren't triumphant or confused. The look in his eyes was pure and utter terror. "What the hell are you?" Ichiro dropped his sword and turned his back on his victim. Leaving the money, the pack, and the wounded boy behind, he grabbed his brother's body and scrambled back into the forest. A small part of Keiru's mind came to the conclusion that he wasn't going to be robbed that day, but honestly, he had other things to worry about at the moment. For instance, why did his stomach feel like it was on fire, like his intestines would burn their way through his abdomen any moment? Keiru glanced down at his body and immediately saw the reason. He was covered in a thin layer of visible chakra, the same flaming color as his hair. He raised one hand to open his GI. A dark symbol on his stomach was now burning red as it spread to encompass his entire torso. A crimson pool was forming beneath his knees, and he wondered if he should be grateful. At least this way he would die without any of the damn Akatsuki getting his demon. I will not die. The sudden declaration resounded through the dying boy's skull, letting him know that the voice originated from a place he thought had been silenced long ago. Stupid fox, muttered Keiru. We die when I run out of blood. You can't change that. However, despite the boy's accepting statement, the angry chakra continued to surround him, enveloping him in a fiery embrace that was filled with sweet pain. It was getting harder to draw breath into his lungs, and his stomach was currently trying to force its way up his esophagus and out of his mouth. He fell onto his hands and knees as his vision began to fade. Strangely, though, instead of going black, the world turned red. I refuse to die. The world exploded into flame as the boy who called himself Keiru died. He could not see, but a red light bled through his closed eyelids. He could not breathe, and yet he was screaming against the pain. He could not hear anything above the roar of the inferno that surrounded him. His body was being torn apart. He could feel his muscles separating from his tendons. Suddenly, silence and darkness reigned. Keiru stopped breathing and let himself fall. He never felt the soft patch of grass, instead of the packed earth of a road, that his body landed on. Inuzuka Hana usually was not assigned missions with shinobi outside her own family or her team. She worked best within her pack, and she preferred caring for her dogs when they needed her most. But the Hokage had needed a tracker, and Hana was available. The scroll had been easy to find, even if Hana hadn't cared for her temporary team. A couple of chunin who seemed very interested in trying to start a conversation about mating habits of her dogs and if Inunukas followed their animal companions in every kind of behavior. Idiots! Running through the trees beside her, Shiro let out a sudden growl, a tense declaration of something nearby. Shiro's found something, Hana suddenly announced to her teammates. Something bloody. It was surprising that she hadn't noticed it before. The scent of blood rose up from the floor of the forest, noticeable even at the high speed they were traveling. But the scent was mixed with several others. The most prominent were fire and burned flesh. The familiar sense of a battle. I see it, the team leader, Izumo, affirmed quickly. He let himself fall from the tree branches and landed next to a male figure sprawled onto the ground. The figure stood out amidst the dirt and underbrush with black pants and some kind of red shirt. His hair was an unusually vibrant red that almost matched his torn and dirty top. Hana leapt from the tree she was perched in and landed lightly on the ground beside the still figure. He looked like a teenager, not much older than any of them, and he smelled strongly of blood, fire, dirt, and sweat. And yet, beneath all these familiar scents, there was something strange that Hana couldn't place. Something malevolent. Hey, kid. Izumo shook the kid's left shoulder lightly. You okay? The boy's right arm was covered in first-degree burns, but the more interesting issue was the skin beneath the burns. It was covered with intricate tattoos that extended from his wrist to his elbow. Hana reached over the body and peeled back the black cloth on the boy's other arm, not entirely surprised when she saw a matching design beneath the arm warmer. Even his palms bore the scrawled stain of ink. Hey, I found a backpack, called the other chunin. Hana raised her head to look at him. Kotetsu held a small canvas bag pulled shut with a simple drawstring. As far as she knew, it wasn't fancy or sturdy enough to be standard issue for a shinobi. And the boy didn't have a high 8 or other identifying mark on him. Unless those tattoos hid something else. Looks like this guy was robbed, Kotetsu noted as he rifled through the pack. He withdrew a piece of cloth and quickly threw it back. There's nothing in here. A sudden groan from the ground caused him to drop the pack guiltily. Hana let out an undignified snort. And he called himself shinobi. But she quickly turned her attention to the source of the groan. The boy on the forest floor, who was apparently only half dead instead of all dead. Hey, can you tell us your name? Izumo leaned over the boy intentionally. Where are you from? Interjected Hana. She still wanted to know if the boy was a threat. Dry lips parted and wheezed in a short breath. Uzu, muttered the boy without opening his eyes. His teeth came together suddenly in a pained groan, cutting off whatever he was going to say next. and he fell back into unconsciousness. Uzu? Hana repeated. Whirlpool? She looked up to Izumo with a frown. I thought it was destroyed. There had been rumors of a civil war within Mist several years ago. The village hidden in Whirlpool was supposedly one of the casualties, but no one in Konoha really knew for sure. Whirlpool had always been a secluded place, as far as Hana knew. Looks more like he was destroyed. Kotetsu took a step closer and craned his neck slightly to look over the body on the ground. Well, let's get him back to Konoha, declared Izumo, leaning back on his knees. Is that wise? Hana wished she could just object and be done with it. But she wasn't the leader of this team, Izumo was. And he was already shifting the boy's body to drape over his back for easy carrying. What's he gonna do? Protested the Chunin. He doesn't even have the strength to stay awake. He smells bad. The declaration was blunt and rushed, a last attempt to say what was really bothering her. However, Izumo and Kotetsu didn't pick up on her anxiety. They frowned at one another, Izumo carrying the boy and the other carrying the luggage. Izumo finally turned back to Hana with an indulgent look, like a teacher patiently listening to a child's excuse. Bad? He repeated. I don't know how to explain it, snapped Hana. But Shiroi's getting a bad feeling from that guy. Like there's something wrong about him. Couldn't that be from the people that attacked him? Kotetsu suggested helpfully. Hana shook her head vigorously. I can't detect any foreign scents in the area. And there hasn't been any rain to wash the scents away, she pointed out. Plus, his wounds are too recent. His skin is still hot from being burned. Wouldn't we have seen any attackers leaving the scene? Izumo frowned and glanced over his shoulder at his cargo. If he is a threat, it's better that we take him to Konoha where we can question him if we need to, declared the team leader. If we leave him out here, it might come back to bite us. Hana ran her tongue over her naturally sharp canines in silence. Izumo had a point. If the boy was a missing nin from Uzu or any other country, it might be better to hold him in Konoha rather than let him wander around high no cur to exact revenge or create chaos or whatever his goal was. Fine, she muttered. Let's go. Izumo smiled again, and the two Chunin leapt into the trees again, speeding towards Konoha. From his position at Hana's side, Shiro let out a small whimper, followed by a rough growl. A mixture of his unease and his certainty that that boy wasn't entirely safe. I know. Hana rested one hand in the dog's thick fur. We'll tell Hokage-sama when we get back, no matter what Izumo thinks. Blue eyes opened to a mass of white, and the first thought that went through his mind was a surprised realization that he wasn't dead. The steady beeping of the heart monitor beside him was proof of that if nothing else. With a deep breath, Keiru used his elbows to push himself into a sitting position. The room he occupied seemed like a generic hospital room, and he wondered who had picked him up. His stomach was swathed in bandages. As he sat up, he could feel the tight, new skin that formed the scar tissue across the stab in his back. Well, at least his new captors had been nice enough to heal him before he set off on the road. Where had he been going again? Not Suna. Maybe tea. Not many people from Konoha were well known in tea. Shaking his head, Keiru glanced around the room again. He didn't see any sign of his small bag. He'd have to find that soon. His seals were starting to itch. His eyes suddenly widened as realization flooded his mind. Keiru pulled back the thin sheet that covered him and studied his body clinically. He was dressed in light hospital pajamas, and his arms were rid of their coverings, which left the complex designs on his forearms exposed for the world to see. That wasn't good. He could be identified by those markings more than anything else. He couldn't see anything on his stomach other than bandages, and for a moment Keiru considered ripping them off just so he could check the skin underneath for something that only he could understand. But the sound of a door opening made Keiru fix his attention on the room instead. Entering the room was a young woman, probably a little older than Keiru himself. She was dressed as a nurse. He didn't think she was old enough to be a doctor or a med nin. After closing the door behind her, the brown-haired nurse looked up and saw Keiru sitting up in his bed, his hands beneath the covers. Oh, you're up. She sounded slightly surprised, as if he had been expected to remain at death's door a while longer. Well, having a demon in one's stomach had to count for something occasionally. Hi, greeted Keiru nervously, mostly because he wasn't sure what else to do. He kept his arms tucked beneath the sheet for a moment, wanting to keep his secrets to himself before realizing that any doctor worth his salt would have removed his clothes for a full view of any wounds he might have had. As a result, They already knew about his markings. Keiru hesitantly slipped his arms out and settled them on top of his lap, staring at his hands instead of at the nurse. Well, that's a good sign, she was quick to reassure him brightly. You must be more hardy than we thought. Keiru chuckled. Hardy had never been a word particularly associated with him. Pig-headed, maybe. Stubborn, definitely. He began again, could you tell me where? His question stopped short when the door opened again, this time to reveal a young man with dark hair hanging in front of his face, pinned down by the high 8 he had wrapped around his head. In the center of the metal band was a spiral symbol with a sharp triangle on one side. Oblivious to Keiru's shocked staring, the young man fixed his eyes on the bed-ridden boy and smiled widely. Hey, he greeted, we were worried you weren't gonna wake up for the next week. You looked pretty bad when we found you. Keiru's wide eyes remained fixed on the man's high 8. Konoha. He was back in Konoha, after all this time trying to escape from the hell it had become. But why was the man wearing a leaf headband? Danzo had eradicated those after he had taken over. His personal root were the new protectors of Konoha, and Root never wore identification. That was the only reason the rookies and the rest of the exiles were able to keep their high 8. What do you want with me? Keiru croaked out, wishing his throat wasn't so dry. I just wanted to check on you. The shinobi of the leaf frowned slightly at Keiru's hostility. Azumo-san, the nurse called. Taro-sensei mentioned that Hokage-sama should be informed of his condition once he woke up. Keiru nearly snapped his vertebrae trying to turn his head to look at the nurse instead. Hokage? There wasn't a Hokage anymore. Not since Danzo had killed Tsunade in the coup that destroyed half of Konoha. What the hell were these people trying to pull? A sudden spasm of pain racked through Keiru's midsection, beginning near his spine and traveling to his navel, searing into his skin with a familiar burn that he had come to associate with a grin of sharp teeth and red chakra. Keiru clutched at his stomach with one hand, digging his fingers into the fabric that concealed his bandages, and grit his teeth to hold back the cry of pain that forced itself up his throat and battered against the back of his teeth. A wave of nausea followed the stifled cry, and Keiru leaned over the side of his bed. The nurse caught his movements just quick enough to hold up a shallow bowl so that Keiru wouldn't muck the floor with the meager contents of his stomach. When he was finished, Keiru gripped the edge of the bed and raised his eyes in one sweeping glance, trying to observe as much as he could without being obvious. The shinobi, Azumo, was in the midst of a grimace after watching the younger boy throw up in front of a pretty girl. Said girl was going about her duty, placing the messy bowl on a tray, hopefully to be removed as soon as possible. Then, his eyes caught a window at the foot of his bed. Beyond the buildings and rooftops of Konoha, Keiru could just see the beginnings of Hokage Mountain, and the solemn stone gazes of Sandaime and Yondaime. Hokage Mountain had faces on it. 4 faces. Half that mountain had been destroyed the last time Keiru had seen it, and he doubted that Danzo would be in any hurry to remake the faces of a position he put no trust in. How could this be happening? What was happening? Keiru reviewed quickly. He had been attacked by those 2 robbers. The fight itself had been short. He didn't even need to use his scroll. We found a small backpack beside you. Azuma was talking again, not that Keiru paid much attention. There wasn't any money in it. Were you robbed? Keiru's eyes widened in realization. He had gotten out his time-freeze scroll. It had been one of the Fuin jutsus he was working on perfecting. A seal that would cause whoever was caught inside it to freeze in time. The results were similar to Shikamaru's Kagemonge no Jutsu, but Keiru's victims were truly frozen, unable to move or think beyond the moment the seal was activated. Keiru hadn't activated the scroll, but he still remembered the voice that refused to die without drastic actions. And now his seals were paining him like they usually did after a release. The combination of the demon's chakra with the time-freeze seal. Shit. Keiru's head sank back against his pillow tiredly. Was what he was considering even possible? Could the seal have transported him backwards in time, before everything went to hell? I'm sure we can get you back on your feet in no time. Azumo gave him a reassuring smile, taking a completely different reasoning for Keiru's swearing. I'll tell Taro-sensei you're awake, announced the nurse. She took the soiled bowl carefully in both hands and hurried out of the room, leaving Keiru alone with the ghost of Konoha in the form of a ninja named Azumo. Keiru stopped short and swallowed hard to clean the bile out of his mouth. When you found me, was there anyone else? Azumo cautiously shook his head. Were you traveling with someone? The dark-haired nin asked. Keiru let out a dry chuckle. Thought I might have taken one of those bastards with me, he explained. If they had been inside the seal, maybe it was possible. But Keiru had heard them running away even if he hadn't seen them. Well, it was probably a good thing he hadn't brought a souvenir from his time. His time? What time was he in, anyway? Namikaze Minato had already been named Yondaime, but had the Kyuubi attacked yet? How was he even supposed to know? Well, Izumo shrugged and smiled once again. Have a speedy recovery. Thanks, Keiru muttered shorted, fully aware that Izumo was expecting him to provide a name. Keiru closed his eyes and forced himself to relax, hoping his feigned exhaustion would discourage the man. Keiru sighed when he heard the door to his room open then close and silence permeated the room. He lay in the hospital bed, his throat still sore from his own bile and his stomach still burning with the remnants of his poisoned chakra, and stared at the ceiling above him in wonder. If he was right, if he had really transported himself to a different time, then his time-space seals were even better than the Yondaimes had ever been. Which would have been a lot more impressive if the entire thing hadn't been a damn fluke. The Hokage Tower was among the largest edifices in Konoha, containing the chambers for the Hokage as well as meeting places for the council, Anbu, and various other workers, all of whom reported to the Hokage as the final authority over the ninja of the village. The fire daimyo might have been the lord of the land, but the Hokage commanded its troops. So, as the aged med nin walked the halls of the Hokage Tower, he could not help rehearsing his concerns before presenting them to the Hokage. Takahashi Taro was getting along in years. He had lived through the Third Great Shinobi War and thought that he had seen the worst that shinobi could do to each other. He would never forget the smell of burnt flesh or the gaping wounds that he had treated in Konoha's hospital as Konoha's defenders trickled back into the village from their missions. But despite his experience as a med nin, even through the war, he had never seen anything quite like the patient that he was currently puzzling over. Hence, his struggle to find the right words to explain his trepidation to Hokage-sama. All too soon, Taro found himself standing in front of the large wooden doors that would lead him into the Hokage's office. Taro took a deep breath and raised his hand, tapping the wood briskly with his knuckles. A friendly voice invited him in, and Taro entered the large office. "Good morning, Taro-san." The gray-haired man behind the desk was smiling already, a pipe clenched comfortably between his teeth. "Ah, morning, Hokage-sama," Taro returned the greeting humbly. He paused as he tried to remember the speech he had laid out before coming. He supposed it was a sign of his age that he was already forgetting things. "You seem troubled," Sandaime noted honestly. "Is there something on your mind?" "Yes," Taro nodded. Sandaime did have a way of putting one at ease with his paternal nature. It was surprisingly easy to forget that he was considered the strongest ninja in Konoha. "It concerns the boy that Izumo's team recently brought in," began the med nin. "His wounds were severe when he was brought in, and yet he has healed at an alarming rate. At first we thought he had just been attacked and robbed while traveling, but—" "Has he said something to make you suspect otherwise?" interjected the Hokage when Taro trailed off hesitantly. "No, Hokage-sama." Taro quickly shook his head in denial. "In fact, he hasn't said very much at all the few times he has woken up. He seems very disoriented and a bit frightened, I think." Izumo himself had described the boy's reaction when he awoke. Taro still had no idea what had caused the nausea, unless the patient had been allergic to some of the medication or antibiotics he was taking. But then, there had also been the quiet demand, "What do you want with me?" In front of Taro, Sandaime simply sat attentively, a thin wisp of smoke traveling upwards from bowl of his pipe. "All he was carrying was a small pack," continued Taro, "with a spare shirt, some basic first aid supplies, a few scrolls, an ink block, and 2 brushes. We haven't been able to open the scrolls, they seem sealed somehow." That was a strange bit of information, according to Taro. In order to know anything about seals, the boy would have to be a shinobi. But there was no Hite-8 on him or in his pack. The only identification he has on him are the strange tattoos we found on his body, Taro finished with a frown. If they are tattoos, the markings on the boy's arms and stomach were by far the most bewildering feature of the patient. Taro had never seen any symbols like them, so he couldn't be sure they weren't a declaration of the boy's allegiance to a rogue shinobi organization or even a yakuza. But there was something else about them. Something that made Taro uneasy. "I see," murmured the Hokage. He removed the stem of his pipe from between his lips and blew out a cloud of sweet-smelling smoke. His eyes stared unseeingly at the desk in front of him. The quiet voice snapped Taro's attention back to the office he occupied. "With your permission, Hokage-sama," Taro's voice grew determined and professional. "I would like to have a seal master look at him so that we may deem him a threat or not." The old man raised his eyes to Taro and smiled as if they were discussing the state of the weather instead of a strange patient who could be a danger to the village. "Certainly," he agreed. "I'll come myself this afternoon." Taro's eyes widened in surprise and concern. Yourself, Hokage-sama?" he confirmed, just in case his old ears had heard the man wrong. However, the Hokage's amused smile made Taro doubt that the man was joking. "Don't worry," chuckled the Hokage. "I'm not quite a dotard yet, Taro-san." Taro nodded, somewhat reassured. It was foolish to be worrying, he told himself. The Hokage would surely have knowledge of the boy's symbols, and if he didn't, he would know what actions to take. Settling back in his chair, Sandaime tapped the ashes out of his pipe into a small tray on his desk as his face took on a far less jovial countenance. "Inuzuka Hana was also worried about the young man," explained the Hokage. "She claimed that her ninkin sensed something off about him." Sandaime looked back at Taro. "It would most likely be best to proceed with caution. Besides, I would like the opportunity to see these tattoos for myself." "Yes, Hokage-sama." Taro bowed slightly and turned to escort himself out. A measure of relief filled him at the prospect. Surely, the Hokage would know what to do. Sakura-chan, a mass of red and pink, twisted horribly and broken. No, couldn't be broken. Someone as strong as her couldn't be so broken. But she was. Sakura-chan. Her name was spoken again, an almost whisper this time, almost as broken as her body was. Naruto. The cool voice of logic, as he had always been. It had been him who pulled Naruto back after Jiraiya's death, and now he was trying to do so after hers. But this was different. "Naruto, we have to go." They were still in danger. Akatsuki was after him and him alone. So Akatsuki had attacked. But why did she have to die? For him? He wasn't worth it. Why couldn't he have died when they first captured him? "No," he whispered. "They're dead." His voice grew louder, fueled by pain and rage. "My team is dead. My family." Searing, red pain again pierced his stomach. He doubled over, resisted the urge to hurl. His arms were itching, the two forces within him conflicting against each other. He couldn't even fight like this. How the hell was he supposed to live now? They were looking at him, waiting for him, but he couldn't do a damn thing about it. Naruto-kun. A softer voice this time, hesitant and shy. Moon-pale eyes met his broken blue orbs and pleaded. "As long as we have PP people to protect, Konoha W will be here and alive." The words forced out of her mouth had once flowed freely from his. His declaration, his determination, his nindo. Tears fell freely. He didn't try to hold them back. She deserved them. She was Sakura-chan, and no one else could be that. She had wanted him to live after he was sure he was going to die. Didn't he owe her that much? Teeth gritted, determination flaring once again. Where were the others? He had to make sure they were safe. Hand braced against knees, blood pulsing and face dripping, Uzumaki Naruto rose. Keiru groaned as he opened his eyes, confused at first. White room, pain in stomach, bandages, oh yeah, hospital. He raised a hand to swipe at his eyes, brushing away the last remnants of sleep. The dream was a familiar one. The day that Sakura had died, Naruto became the sole survivor of Konoha's Team 7. The team that had been Naruto's first family. "Ah, it is good to see you awake." A soft, friendly voice sounded from somewhere near the door. Keiru's heart jumped within his chest as he sat up. He hated being in the hospital, it dulled his senses. The smell of antiseptic overpowered everything, and he hadn't even noticed the old man in the corner of the room. But he stared now. "Easy, there." The old man in white robes stepped forward and held out one hand in a calming gesture. "No one intends to hurt you here." "Sandaime?" Keiru barely breathed. "Sandaime Hokage. I'm in Konoha." Right, he had screwed up. He blamed the fox. It was a lot easier to blame things going wrong on an ancient demon than think that he could have somehow prevented this. But the fact remained that he didn't know exactly when he was in Konoha. Yondaime's face on the mountain, but Sandame wearing the Hokage robes. Yes. Sandame smiled, oblivious to Keiru's train of thought. I'm afraid you have an old man at a disadvantage. I can't remember if we've met. Keiru's eyes snapped to the old man who had been his first example of a shinobi, of a Hokage, and he blurted out the first thing that came to mind. You look different than the mountain. The Hokage looked amused at that response. Stone is not the best representation of one's face, I'm afraid. He paused, glancing over the figure in the hospital bed. Keiru noticed that the man didn't have his all-too-familiar pipe. They probably didn't let him smoke in the hospital. Keiru missed the scent of smoke that he always associated with the man. Your name? Inquired the old man in the same kind voice. Keiru. That had been his name for the past 3 months. He might as well keep it. Do you know what happened to you on the road? Keiru looked away and frowned. They were trying to rob me, he answered without naming names. They probably would have succeeded, too. It's not like he was in any position to throw them off while trying to contain his evil. Stupid. He stopped short, wondering where the Konoha shinobi had found him. Would there even be robbers where he had been? He wasn't that close to Konoha when he had been attacked, so maybe they carried him back. Keiru sighed and covered his eyes with one hand. Maybe it would have been easier all around if he had just pretended to have amnesia. I don't know, he finally finished. I don't remember everything. It was a cop-out, but he couldn't do any better. It was a little late for amnesia, anyway. I understand you're from Whirlpool. The voice came from beyond Keiru's curtained eyes. He sincerely hoped the slight tensing of his muscles wasn't visible. Why did they think he was from Whirlpool? Did they recognize him? But he couldn't look too much like Uzumaki Naruto anymore. He lacked the markings of a Jinchuriki, and his hair was the wrong color. No, someone had been talking to him when he lay bleeding. He remembered a question, his name. What had he said? Uzumaki? Damn, had he been that stupid? Why were you on the road in the first place? The Hokage asked. Keiru paused, his thoughts racing. What excuse could he possibly think up? He could be traveling, looking for a new place to live, so that he would be invited into Konoha. But that kind of excuse was flimsy. They might think he was a spy. But what other reason could someone have for traveling from Whirlpool to? Keiru met the Hokage's gaze again, a sudden idea forming. I was looking for someone, the red-headed boy answered carefully. Someone in Konoha. Uzumaki Kushina. Kakashi had told him about his parents after Konoha fell, abruptly and without much detail. Keiru still thought that he had only done so because there was no one else left who knew about Uzumaki Kushina and Namikaze Minato. But it had been a small comfort to know that Yondaime hadn't picked him simply because he was unwanted and unloved, an orphan designated to carry the Kyuubi. Meanwhile, his careful statement was having a strange effect on Sandame. The man had frozen in his place, his dark eyes fixed sharply on Keiru. How do you know her? Demanded the Hokage. Keiru sat up straighter, his eyes hopeful for the first time and he didn't know how long. Sandame knew Kushina, which could mean that she was still alive. Keiru knew that he hadn't had a mother when he was a kid, but there had to be someone taking care of him as a baby, right? Maybe his mom was alive. She's my cousin. The lie came out quick and easy, dismissed immediately in favor of more answers. I'm looking for her. Do you know where she is? The Hokage sighed and let the tension seep from his worn body. Keiru saw and wondered if he would hear once again that he was alone in the world. Well, you are still in the process of recovering, the Hokage noted simply. Keiru grit his teeth together to keep from swearing. It'd probably be a bad idea to swear at the Hokage, especially since he didn't have the reputation of Konoha's #1 knuckle-headed, hyperactive, surprising ninja. He still didn't know if Kakashi had meant that as a compliment or insult. Then, Keiru saw Sandame's eyes flicker to Keiru's bare arms and the dark designs that still remained exposed. Impulsively, Keiru grabbed at his right forearm with his left hand, as if that would be enough to hide the markings. Hey, you didn't. Keiru stopped and caught his breath. Couldn't shout. Keiru wasn't known for shouting in this Konoha. No one did anything to these, did they? He asked nervously. Why wouldn't you want them to? The Hokage frowned. They're seals, answered Keiru honestly. I hate having them, but they keep me alive. And he was supposed to stay alive. Although, this time freeze-turned transportation thing was making things a bit more complicated than he liked. Would his seals still work? I see, was all the Hokage said, contemplatively. Sandaime stared at Keiru, at his worried and hopeful eyes, at his red hair, at the dark patterns on his arms, half covered by a desperate hand. Keiru was careful not to flinch, that wouldn't win him any points for integrity. Finally, the Hokage straightened, apparently finished with his perusal. "I will have someone escort you to my office tomorrow morning, Keiru-san," Sandaime announced, once again smiling encouragingly. "Provided you are recovered enough, we can talk more at that time." Keiru simply nodded as the Hokage took his leave. When the door closed, Keiru let his shoulders slump tiredly. There was a chance that his mother could be alive. He didn't even know what she looked like. But now Sandaime had seen his markings and knew that they were seals. How was he going to explain what he was to a Konoha that already hated one Jinchuriki of the Kyuubi no Kitsune? Sarutobi Hiruzen sat down behind his wide desk carefully while he pinched his pipe expertly between his thumb and first two fingers. The young man standing in the center of the room was obviously nervous but not so much in a frightened manner, like a shinobi who knew he was in enemy territory. Instead, the young redhead was stealing not quite subtle enough glances around the office while still keeping his attention fixed on the Sandaime Hokage. The young man had been released from the hospital and was dressed plainly in a long-sleeved dark shirt coupled with dark pants and zori. He carried his small canvas pack over one shoulder. As far as Sandaime knew, that small pack contained the only things the boy had left. He could almost be mistaken for an off-duty Junin. Sarutobi captured the end of his pipe between his teeth and sucked in a lungful of the sweet smoke. He had already sent for the one person in Konoha who could claim a connection with the new boy, but in the meantime there were still questions that needed asking. "You said you were coming here from Whirlpool?" he inquired, his voice calm without any hint of interrogation. "Yeah," the young man answered shortly, still looking around the room. The elderly Hokage leaned back in his chair. The boy looked like a teenager, maybe 16 or 17 years old. And he did have some features of that spunky kunoichi that Minato had found. His hair was the same shade of bright red, and there was a look around his chin that reminded Sarutobi of Kushina. But as the young man's eyes came to rest on the portraits of former Hokages on a mantle, Sarutobi couldn't help but notice that those eyes, wide, observant, and piercingly blue, were something entirely different. "No one's heard from that village in some time," was all the Hokage said. Whirlpool had always been small and insignificant in the eyes of the elemental countries. Its destruction by the Mizukage had passed by largely unnoticed. Sandaime was curious if the boy was aware of the state of his supposed homeland or if he had merely chosen the village for a cover story merely because of its triviality. The boy looked down, his eyes hooded, before meeting Sarutobi's kind gaze. "For good reason," muttered Kushina's self-declared cousin. "My village is gone." It was said matter-of-factly and quickly. One of the boy's hands rose to rest at the back of his neck. "I've been wandering around the elemental countries for a while," he explained slowly, as if choosing his words carefully. "I've been pretty much everywhere but Konoha. I always avoided Konoha." Sarutobi let a thin stream of smoke escape from his parted lips as he looked at the boy in front of him. His emotions were easy to read, a mixture of shame and nervousness. It could be that the boy was lying, and doing a very poor job of it, but his emotions could also be explained by the fact that he was currently explaining his situation to the leader of a village he had admittedly been avoiding. "Any particular reason?" inquired Sandaime curiously. The boy's face fell into a serious sadness that seemed too old for his young features. "Kushina never said why she left Whirlpool to come here. Our family wasn't." He paused and looked down again, avoiding the old man's eyes. "We weren't on good terms. But I don't have anywhere left to go." He looked up hopefully to the Hokage. Sarutobi hated this part of his job. He had been hoping to find something wrong with the young man's story. Some clue that would explain away the boy's presence or prove that there had been a mistake. But the boy looked so desperate for his answer that Sarutobi found it hard to believe that his expression was faked. "I'm sorry." He nodded his head slowly, sadly. Uzumaki Kushina died almost 12 years ago. He watched as the boy's blue eyes slowly widened in shock. 12 years. "Hey, Ojiji." A loud voice disrupted the dazed tension in the office as a blur of orange darted through the doors. Uzumaki Naruto burst into the office of the Hokage with his usual exuberance, his new high 8 tied proudly across his forehead. The taller redhead spun in surprise and stared at the boy with the shocked look still firmly planted on his face. "What's going on?" Naruto demanded, ignoring the Hokage's guest completely. "I have to get ready for tomorrow." The corners of Sarutobi's mouth lifted amusedly. Nothing, not even the recent realization of why everyone in Konoha was so cold to him, could keep Uzumaki Naruto down for long. "Naruto, I called you here for something important." Sarutobi held his pipe in one hand as he stood up and walked slowly around the desk. Immediately, Naruto's eyes widened as he perked up. "Really?" The boy's smile grew to stretch his marked cheeks to bursting. Hey, what is it, oh Gigi?" Sarutobi stood just behind the red-haired boy, who hadn't taken his wide eyes off the small, excited figure in front of him. "We have a visitor to Konoha," Sandaime explained as he nodded towards his guest. "I wonder if you would let him stay with you." "With me? Why?" Naruto's cry was indignant. "I'm a ninja now. I don't have time to babysit. Just make him get a hotel or something." The teenager turned to Sandaime in a daze. He didn't seem to be able to form any further words as one of his hands gestured feebly to the angry boy in the center of the room. The Hokage just smiled. "This is Uzumaki Naruto," he explained deliberately. "He's her son." "What's going on?" shouted Naruto again. He jabbed one finger rudely at the stunned teenager. "Who the heck are you, anyway?" "Keiru," the boy answered abruptly. His eyes snapped to the young figure, blocking out everything else around him as he stepped forward. Uzumaki Keiru. He knelt down in front of the new genin, and two pairs of blue eyes met each other. "I knew your mother." A single blink was all it took to change Naruto's face from indignant to surprised. "Really?" Naruto murmured, all bravado gone. "You did? Well, I'll leave you two to get acquainted," Sarutobi suddenly announced. Two pairs of blue eyes looked to him as if just realizing that they weren't alone in the room. "Maybe tomorrow, you can come visit me, Keiru-san, and we'll see how we can help you." The boy named Uzumaki Keiru nodded slowly, silently, and stood up. Uzumaki Naruto seemed to take on Keiru's dazed look before a mixture of suspicion and curiosity twisted his lips into a strange frown as he stared at the taller Uzumaki. Still, Naruto led the other boy out of the Hokage tower, presumably toward the small, always slightly dirty apartment that he had lived in since the boy turned 6 and moved out of the Konoha orphanage. Sarutobi turned to the window and spoke softly as soon as the two Uzumakis had left. "Bring Hitaki Kakashi here, and make sure he's not late," the Hokage ordered. The masked Anbu hovering on the roof of the Hokage tower disappeared without a word of assent, but Sarutobi was satisfied. As a Hokage, he knew the dangers of leaving a Jinchuriki in the hands of an unknown person, most likely someone with ninja training if not a ninja on a mission. But, he also knew that Naruto had no one. The boy looked up to Amino Iruka immensely, and the teacher had been a turning force in Naruto's ordeal the previous night. Naruto deserved to have someone who would look at him the way family was supposed to. Besides, Keiru had looked truly shocked when Sarutobi had announced that Kushina was dead. Perhaps he would find it easy to cling to a boy who nearly personified the lively Kunoichi from Whirlpool. In the meantime, it would help to have someone as observant as Kakashi to watch over the boys, especially since Naruto was on the reluctant Junin's team. The 17-year-old redhead was speechless. Fortunately, he was currently hiding his shock by studying his surroundings as closely as possible. He recognized some features of his old apartment, such as the potted plant in one corner that was slowly being nursed back to health. But other points of his memory were fuzzy. Not surprising, considering he had moved out of this place soon after he had returned to Konoha after his training trip with Jiraiya. "Hey," the short blonde behind him called out as he locked the door, "do you really know who my mom is?" The older boy studied the younger one. Uzumaki Naruto was looking at Keiru with barely concealed hope. Keiru remembered himself like this, wondering where his parents were, especially when all the other parents came to the academy to pick up their kids. He looked into blue eyes that matched his exactly, and for the first time since Kakashi's death he was thankful for the change in his appearance. "Uzumaki Kushina," Keiru answered. Might as well stick with the lie he had already propagated. He didn't think it would take much to adapt it to his current situation. "She was my cousin. She died in the Kyuubi attack." Chalk up yet another reason to hate the damn fox. Like he had needed any more. "Oh." Naruto looked down, falling silent for only a moment before his eyes turned once again to his newfound relative. "What about my father? Did you know him, too?" This time there was no attempt at concealing anything, the boy was desperately hopeful. It was that look that decided Keiru's answer more than anything. No, he couldn't say it. He had only learned the truth of his parentage after growing up knowing that the Yondaime was a great Hokage, probably the greatest that had ever lived. He didn't know if he would be okay with it if he hadn't learned by now the kind of sacrifice that a Hokage had to make. And it wasn't something he thought he could explain. Not until he had seen it firsthand. Not to mention the extenuating circumstances about Biju, Akatsuki, and Uchiha that no one in Konoha was supposed to know about, much less him. But if the tense look on the short blonde's face was any indication, Keiru would not be let off without giving some kind of explanation. Time to lie through his teeth again. Kushina left Whirlpool to come to Konoha. The redhead slipped the small pack from one shoulder as he turned away from the young boy. I never heard from her again. It was surprisingly easy to put on the air of a disgruntled guy who didn't want to talk about his family. Must have been all that time with Sasuke. "So, where were you?" demanded Naruto. "Living under a rock? Why didn't you come here sooner?" His features were marred into an angry frown, but his sky-blue eyes tore a sad accusation into Keiru. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" The redhead drew in a breath. Maybe he should have practiced his lying skills before heading out on his own. His eyes had always been too expressive to lie convincingly. "I didn't know," Keiru snapped back. "I didn't know where she was or what she was doing. I didn't know you existed." His eyes fell away from his accuser. They always did when he was lying. Jiraiya had once told him that Konoha would be lost if the blonde Jinchuriki was ever captured by the enemy, since Uzumaki Naruto couldn't tell a lie to save his life. He was, however, very good at keeping secrets. The small blonde genin looked away as well, apparently reading Keiru's guilt for lying as something else. "What's Whirlpool like?" Naruto suddenly asked. The corners of Keiru's mouth turned up slightly at the change in subject. "Small village. It always had been, according to what little he had been able to learn after Kakashi told him of his heritage. Everybody's pretty friendly. Or, they were. What happened to them?" questioned Naruto with a slightly teasing smile. "They get cranky or something? They were killed," Keiru answered bluntly. Everyone's dead." Keiru shook his head quickly. At this rate, he was going to get confused, combining what he knew about Whirlpool with what he remembered about Konoha. And it would do him no good to dwell on the scenes he had witnesses. They plagued him enough when he considered his failures. And he knew what kind of madness the pain of losing everyone he cared about could bring him. What Sasuke had become was a prime example. Keiru looked back up at Naruto, who was looking at his own feet guiltily. "You said you had to get ready for tomorrow," Keiru reminded the boy. "Oh, yeah." Naruto looked up again, glad for the distraction. "Kakashi-sensei's making us do survival training." Keiru smiled genuinely. "Ah, the infamous bell test. You'd better go to sleep, then," he ordered the smaller boy. "But, I gotta read up on all this stuff," protested Naruto, gesturing to the mess of scrolls resting on his table. He pursed his lips together in a guilty pout and looked at his feet. "I missed out on a lot." Keiru's lips parted in a grin. He had probably been the worst student in the history of the Ninja Academy, and that was with the consideration that Shikamaru had slept through most of his classes. It just didn't work. He had always learned best through hands-on work, not lectures. This stuff isn't as important as the rules. Keiru picked up one of the scrolls and glanced over it. Meditation techniques? Where had he even gotten this? Meditation wouldn't help him unless he wanted to talk to the fox at will. Might be a helpful tool at times, but he had never really enjoyed his conversations with the giant demon. What rules? Naruto's confusion broke into Keiru's thoughts. The older boy set down the scroll again and turned to face his younger self. "The rules," he repeated simply. "The rules that apply to everyone in life, not just shinobi." The rules was his own name for what he had learned from listening to stories, from traveling with Jiraiya, and from seeing that there were some traits that everyone shared. Life had taught him its lessons, and Keiru had learned if only because his choices were pay attention or be killed. "You know, those rules," Keiru declared with a nod, like a sensei to a student. "And one of them is, get a good night's sleep before you face scary one-eyed Junin." The adolescent frowned slightly and stared at the teenager, trying to bend his words into something his mind could comprehend. Kaoru smiled in triumph at the boy. He reached out a hand and tousled the blonde hair. "Go to sleep, Gaki," he commanded again. "Hey, I'm not a brat," shouted Naruto. Kaoru ignored the shouting, picked up his small pack, and dumped it onto the lumpy couch in Naruto's large front room. Among the pack's scanty contents were several scrolls and brushes, as well as a slab for mixing ink. "You got a bathroom?" Kaoru could use a shower, and his arms were starting to itch again. Naruto grunted his assertion and pointed out a door that Kaoru already remembered. Kaoru stepped into the small, grimy bathroom and closed the door behind him, peering at the mirror. A tired face stared back at him with eyes the color of ocean depths. He raised a hand and stroked the red hair at his temple, just to confirm that it was his. This was why he didn't like mirrors. He didn't even look like Uzumaki Naruto anymore. The markings on his cheeks, which had always looked like whiskers to him, were gone. He lifted his arms and pulled his long-sleeved shirt over his head. He would have to get some new clothes, but that would present a new problem. He didn't like leaving his seals exposed for everyone to see, but he hadn't been able to find his red gi or the arm warmers that had covered them. Between his fight with the robbers and the backlash of his freaky jutsu that wasn't supposed to happen, they had probably been destroyed. So, he needed to find a way to hide the seals that made him what he was, a demon. 6 months after the fall of Konoha, Uzumaki Naruto leaned back in the chair he had fallen into and wiped his mouth. He could still taste the bitter bile on his tongue, and he spit a gob of discolored saliva into the bowl beside him. A steady hand appeared in front of him with a glass of water. Naruto grimaced as he took it, greedily swallowing the liquid to rid his mouth of the foul taste. The 3 others in the room watched silently for a moment before the sole female knelt in front of Naruto's chair and placed her hands on his stomach. "Don't drink so fast," Ino commanded in her med-nin voice. "You'll just get sick again." Naruto didn't respond as he handed the empty glass back to the stoic case-cage. He'd have to apologize later to Gaara for stinking up his office. "Has this been happening often?" Ino turned to the dark figure in a corner of the office. "Ever since we got back from Iwa," Shikamaru muttered around the cigarette dangling between his lips. He had been smoking more often now. It was hard to separate his scent from the smell of cigarette smoke that followed him constantly. Naruto sighed slightly as he felt the muscles around his abdomen relax from their state of tension. The pain subsided under Ino's glowing hands until Naruto felt he could breathe again without being in danger of losing his lunch and dinner, and whatever else he had been able to eat. A soft clink made him look up to see Gaara setting the glass down on his desk. The case-cage was 16 now, only a few months younger than Naruto, but the robes made him look older. He still had those dark circles around his eyes, proof that it remained as hard for him to sleep as it had ever been. Naruto never asked or admonished Gaara about his sleeping habits. Being tormented by your own personal demon was someone he could understand completely. Naruto shifted in his chair. Ino's hands on his stomach were starting to tickle now that his stomach had relaxed enough to register their presence. Gently, he took the med-nin's hands in his and pushed her away. "Stop that," he commanded softly. Ino shot him a glare that Naruto was sure Tsunade had taught to all future med-nin of Konoha. "Naruto, where are the others?" Naruto demanded of Shikamaru before Ino could get started on her rant. Shikamaru gave a simple shrug. "They're on their way. What's the hurry?" One side of Naruto's mouth turned up in a lopsided attempt at his famous grin. "What's wrong? Too troublesome, Nara?" asked a red-headed Naruto sarcastically. He hoped that Shikamaru wouldn't notice his hands curling into fists on his knees, but knowing Shikamaru, it was wishful thinking. In truth, Naruto wasn't looking forward to the conversation he knew was coming. For whatever reasons they had, the rookies had started looking to him for what to do after Konoha fell. Fat lot of good it did them. They had been cut down to half their original number. Naruto swallowed a sudden rising of bile again and tried not to let his discomfort show on his face. It had been Kakashi who first named them the rookies, 4 three-man teams of Konoha Genin who had all taken the Chunin exams during the Sound Invasion and survived. Not only survived but helped defend their village. The title was an ironic one, derived from the fact that all 12 of the former Genin could give their teachers a run for their money by the time they were 15 or 16. Naruto looked up when he heard at least 2 sets of decisive footsteps. Neji entered the office of the case cage first, his stride purposeful and confident, followed by Hinata, whose sandaled feet barely made a sound on the wooden floor. Kiba brought up the rear with Akamaru limping beside him. The white dog hadn't walked straight since Pain had first entered Konoha and destroyed a quarter of the village in his search for the final Jinchuriki. That had been the first of Naruto's successive failures. Naruto had been at Mount Myobokuzen, training, when he heard about the Akatsuki's attack. In their drive to find him, the rogue organization had ransacked Konoha. Naruto arrived only in time to lure Pain and Konan away from Konoha, letting off a burst of Kyuubi's chakra that had the entire village in an uproar. It was only after Akatsuki had retreated that the full damage was seen. Guy had lost his life, leaving Lee and the rest of the taijutsu specialists team devastated. And then, there was the backlash of explaining exactly why Akatsuki was after Naruto. He didn't know whether to be pleased or guilty that all of the rookies took the news so well. They never blamed him for his enemies, or the struggles he faced with his demon. Now, even the remnant left of Konoha looked to Naruto for leadership. But, as usual, Kiba was the first of them to demand an explanation. "What's going on, hothead?" The insult had become Kiba's personal name for Naruto ever since the once blonde shinobi had returned from his nearly 3-year training trip. Naruto just swallowed nervously and rose from his chair. He peeled off the black arm warmers that covered his forearms, flinching when his thumbnails scraped against the dark seals. The room became quiet at the sight. Naruto had never explained his seals to anyone, not even the other 5 remaining rookies. They only knew that the seals on his arms held back the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Naruto threw the arm warmers onto the chair behind him and raised his eyes to the oldest boy in the room, still only 18. "Neji, what can you see?" Naruto's gaze flickered down to his own body, a silent indication of what he wanted Neji to check out. A small frown crossed Neji's face, just a brief moment when his eyebrows closed together, before he complied, bringing his hands together and activating his bloodline. Naruto resisted the urge to tense as if expecting a blow. Neji's Byakugan was the strongest among his clan. Naruto just needed to confirm what he knew was happening to him. Neji finished his perusal quickly and met Naruto's eyes, his own pearly eyes still framed by almost visible veins. "It appears the Kyuubi's chakra is..." Neji frowned deeply, searching for words, "eating at your own coil system." It's damaging my organs," interrupted Naruto as he hung his head. "I know. You know?" Ino repeated indignantly. "You knew this was happening?" Naruto refused to meet her eyes. Her accusing gaze, though not the exact color green, would be the same piercing one that Sakura would have every time he knowingly put himself in danger. "Why?" Naruto glanced up at Shikamaru. The genius had taken the cigarette out of his mouth in order to utter the one-word question. For an answer, Naruto lifted up the hem of his black t-shirt, exposing his stomach. The symbol embedded into his skin was always visible, always a reminder. "This seal isn't the same as Yondaimi's," he began. "It started out the same, a spiral around his navel with 8 kanji around it. But this seal extended beyond Yondaimi's original one." Lines traced the patterns of Naruto's chakra coils, from his stomach to his sides and up to the bottom of his ribcage. "When Yondaime sealed Kyuubi into me, he split it." Naruto explained what he had learned from Kakashi, a crash course in Fuin Jutsu. "Only the yin chakra was in my seal. But when Akatsuki extracted the Biju, they somehow got both halves." "How's that possible?" Gaara demanded. His brow was furrowed in what could have been a frown. It was hard to tell with Gaara. His arms were folded across his chest, making him look like a shinobi instead of a cage. "I dunno." Naruto lifted one hand to scratch at the back of his head. "Maybe the yang chakra was in me all along. Maybe it was a different part of the seal. I'm not a master at this." He had only had 3 months with Kakashi-sensei. Even with his cage bunshin, he couldn't experience everything that Kakashi had to teach. And even Kakashi hadn't known as much as Namikaze Minato had. But when Kakashi, his throat closed, and Naruto wondered if his seals were going to start acting up again. But this pain wasn't in his stomach. It was only his heart that felt Kakashi's name. When Kakashi-sensei sacrificed himself to seal Kyuubi again, he sealed all of Kyuubi's chakra into me. Yin and yang. Naruto dropped his shirt again, letting it cover his stomach. He was finding it hard to meet all the eyes on him, all curious or demanding in some form or another. The human body isn't meant to take that kind of yuki, he announced solemnly. That's why you've been getting sick, isn't it? Hinata's eyes were wide, just dropping out of her own Byakugan. She had seen the same thing as Neji. Yeah, one of Naruto's hands rose to rub at the back of his head guiltily. Kyuubi's chakra is tied into mine, so it acts like poison. It had been the only way to keep him alive and keep the Kyuubi out of Akatsuki's hands at the time. Reseal the demon back into Naruto. Unfortunately, nothing ever worked the same way twice with a Biju. I thought those seals on your arms suppressed it, demanded Kiba. His confused frown was mirrored on Akamaru's white face. Naruto shook his head vigorously. They're not working, he blurted quickly. I have to redraw them almost every other night, and they're not stopping the final result, just slowing it. Silence greeted Naruto's pronouncement, and he dared to hope that no one would ask what the final result would be. Then he could just tell them what he was going to do, and… Fuck. Shikamaru's sudden swearing disrupted any thought Naruto had of escaping quietly. The cigarette was dangling limply from Shikamaru's hands, ready to drop at any moment, as he stared directly into Naruto's far too expressive blue eyes. You're dying, the Nara concluded quietly. It's killing you. Naruto's hand rose to rest at the back of his neck, a sheepish habit he had never been able to stop. He guessed it was too much to hope for, with Shikamaru's talent for analysis. He probably would have been able to figure out what was wrong with Naruto even without the Byakugan. It's always been killing me. His head dropped down. Both Tsunade and Jiraiya had warned him about relying on the fox's chakra. Anytime he drew it out, his lifespan would shorten. Just going faster now. The silence was tense and uncomfortable. Hinata's hands remained clasped in front of her as her lips moved, trying to form words that no one could hear. Gaara was clutching his own arms tightly, his fingers making creases in his official robes. And Kiba was still frowning, puzzled, at Naruto, as he tried to determine what had made Konoha's #1 knuckle-headed, hyperactive, surprising ninja just pronounce his own death sentence. What can we do? Ino quickly jumped up eagerly, glancing between Shikamaru, Neji, and Naruto, pleading with someone to provide an answer. Her light blue eyes finally rested on the redhead. I'll heal you. We can keep you alive. Naruto grabbed the young woman's shoulders to stop her desperation and forced her to look him in the eye. Ino, I'm going to die. He had already accepted it, why couldn't they? It would make things a hell of a lot easier. Kyuubi's tied into me so much now, I'm not even Jinchuriki anymore. See, no whiskers. He released her to rub the back of his knuckles across his smooth, unblemished cheek. Almost of its own accord, his fingers trailed their way into his short, red locks. And the damn fox took my hair. Naruto dropped his hands guiltily when he saw Ino's pained, pitying expression. He didn't mean to make any of them feel sorry for him. And what was so wrong with knowing you were going to die? Shinobi died all the time. Any one of them could be killed for leaving their village and seeking refuge in Suna. The fact that he was going to die because of a giant, evil fox rather than one of Danzo's root just gave him the slight satisfaction that the traitor wouldn't get the bounty on Naruto's head. Anyway, it doesn't matter, sighed Naruto, turning back to the chair. He picked up his arm warmers and slipped them on. I'm leaving in the morning. What? Kiba's hot, immediate dissent was the loudest, but Naruto was fairly sure he could hear Hinata stuttering in protest from the other side of the room. Suddenly, an open palm caught him across the cheek. Although not nearly as devastating as the punches he had come to expect when he did or said something stupid, the force of the slap was enough to snap his head to the side. Ino, what was that for? Growled Neji in a rare display of anger. Naruto couldn't say exactly why the Hyuga prodigy was so willing to defend someone he had once called a loser, because Naruto had certainly failed at everything lately in life. "'Cause Sakura isn't here to knock some sense into him," Ino answered hotly. The mention of his former teammate's name only hardened Naruto's resolve. He swallowed thickly to steel himself against Kiba's rage and Ino's teary frown. "I have to do this," Naruto announced with all the finality he had had when declaring that he would never give up on Uchiha Sasuke. "There's something I still have to do." Shikamaru's dark eyes flickered. Naruto could practically see his thoughts racing behind his calm exterior. "What, you're gonna go wipe out Danzo?" Kiba was a little more vocal in his demand, teeth bared in an almost growl. "Not smart enough for that." One side of Naruto's mouth rose in a sardonic smile, an evaluation of his own talents. His smile dropped as he nodded once at the genius. He's Shikamaru's. I gotta find the last Uchiha. You're planning to die, Neji stated in realization. His Byakugan was still active, taking in all of Naruto's features, changed and unchanged, as well as the nonverbal signs that proved Naruto was just as serious about this as he had ever been about anything regarding his former village. Naruto just lifted his shoulders into an uncaring shrug that Shikamaru would be envious of. Nothing I can do about that, he said nonchalantly. As long as I take him with me. Although he would never admit it out loud, Naruto thought he had a good idea of how Sasuke had felt when he left Konoha. Sasuke was determined to do anything for the power to kill the one who had killed his family. Naruto would do the same thing to the one who had killed his. The Avenger had to be avenged. Someone should go with you, Shikamaru declared suddenly. It's troublesome, but don't even think about it, Nara. Naruto's gaze turned sharp as his eyes snapped towards Shikamaru. You gotta take care of Akio. Akio was the newborn son of Kurenai, the son of Shikamaru's former sensei, and Naruto knew how important the child was to Shikamaru. This was why he had to go alone. All the rest of the rookies still had teammates or at least family they had to look after. I'll be fine on my own. Naruto waved one hand to reassure his comrades gathered in the room. It would be better for you to remain here. Gaara's tone was quiet but firm, and Naruto had no doubt that his statement was actually a command. Naruto just folded his arms across his chest, mirroring the Cage's pose. Can't order me around, Gaara, he declared cheekily. I'm a noob nin, remember? Gaara's shoulders slumped in relaxation, which Naruto found strange. The Cage wasn't normally one to give up so easily. Please, murmured Gaara. Naruto's arms fell to his sides, and his eyes found the floor abruptly. That's fighting dirty. He could handle accusations and anger easily, but Naruto never wanted to see his friends in pain. His blue eyes rose again, pleading silently with Gaara to understand. Pain is still alive. If Akatsuki still thinks they can get Kyuubi out of me, I don't want to lead them here. Gaara remained expressionless for a moment then nodded solemnly. This was something both of the former Jinchuriki could understand. Those who were precious to you were those whom you protected. At any cost. Naruto-kun. Hinata stepped forward until she stood in front of the dejected ninja. You don't have to do this alone. Please, Naruto. Keiru, he interrupted her abruptly, his eyes turning pained and cold. Uzumaki Naruto may have been Jinchuriki, but he was never a demon. Call me Keiru. The last time Hitaki Kakashi had felt like he was his own person was when he graduated from the Shinobi Academy at the tender age of 5, the youngest anyone had ever done so. For that moment he was acknowledged as a prodigy, a boy with great potential. And then his father had gone on that cursed mission. After the death of Hitaki Tsukumo, Kakashi had lived and killed under the shameful shadow of his father. And he had continued to do so until he suddenly found a new shadow to live under. One that far fewer people recognized. With the gift of Obito's Sharingan, Kakashi was able to see chakra, hand seals, entire jutsus, and use them to make a new name for himself. Copy Nin Kakashi, master of 1,000 jutsus. However, it was a shadow that he would bear without comment, if only so that there would be some part of Obito still living in a Konoha that deserved a much better ninja than the prodigy Hitaki Kakashi. Although a part of him wondered if Sandaime had agreed to meet him at Naruto's apartment simply so that Kakashi would have no excuse for being late. Kakashi was still looking around the apartment. There were several spots on the wall where the graffiti hadn't been quite cleaned off and covered instead with posters or peeling paint. When Sandaime stepped inside the unlocked door, the old man already had his pipe in his mouth and a contemplative look about his mouth. Kakashi, the Hokage, greeted neutrally. Hokage-sama. Kakashi turned from his study of the wall towards his leader. Is this boy really who he says he is? The old man clasped his hands behind his back as he walked around the wooden table, the only piece of furniture in the small kitchen that was littered with academy scrolls and textbooks. The canvas pack belonging to Naruto's sudden guest was noticeably absent. Did you observe anything that would give way to doubts? Sandaime had a way of questioning that forced his subordinates to reveal their minds before he gave away anything of what was going on in his. No. To be fair, Kakashi's night of observation had turned out to be rather boring. He told Naruto about Kushina, but he said he didn't know anything about his father. They didn't talk much before Naruto went to bed. Keiru stayed up, drawing on his arms with his brushes, but then he slept on the futon. There were some small indications of Keiru's presence. A carton of expired milk was discarded haphazardly in a garbage can, and the small cushions on the futon were straightened. Keiru had left the apartment shortly after Naruto sped off to the training grounds to wait for a sensei who now stood in his living quarters. Kakashi still didn't know where Keiru had gone, due to his necessary meeting with the Hokage. "I see." Kakashi's singular uncovered eyes snapped to the old man, darkening with the suspicions he usually kept firmly hidden under his crooked hide. "Kushina never said anything about a cousin," remarked Kakashi as he tucked his hands into his pockets. His sensei had always been a private man. Oh, Minato was friendly and patient. He had to be to put up with the chaos that made up his three-man team. But Kushina was the one who had shouted her declaration to catch Konoha's yellow flash at the top of her lungs. The red-headed kunoichi from Whirlpool had never left anyone in doubt of her feelings or her loyalties. Even so, Kakashi had never heard that she had a 5-year-old, ginger-haired cousin. Kushina did not say much about her family to anyone, I believe, the Hokage countered calmly. And Keiru said that Kushina did not leave Whirlpool on good terms. Perhaps that animosity was passed on to Keiru until he lost the rest of his family. The aged leader clamped his pipe in his mouth as he sank into one of the chairs surrounding the table, as if his old legs would not support him much longer. Jiraiya might know something more, he speculated. He was Minato's sensei, after all. Is Jiraiya-sama coming back to Konoha, Hokage-sama? Kakashi raised his eyebrow, interested. Maybe the Sannin would have more insight into Kushina's supposed family. Kakashi would feel a lot better if he only knew the identity of the boy who had just conveniently shown up in Konoha to insert himself into Uzumaki Naruto's life. He is due for a visit before the Chunin exams, answered Sandaime with a fond smile. Until then, we will merely watch this Keiru. He pinned Kakashi with eyes that seemed too sharp to belong to an arthritic old man. He may simply be a boy looking for his family, Kakashi. Kakashi grimaced. He knew Naruto was alone, had been alone for all his life. But Kakashi had never been good with kids, probably because he had never been one himself. The years immediately following Yondaime's death were spent in Anbu for Kakashi, and by the time he got out, Naruto seemed to have a set pattern already established for surviving. Kakashi was already splitting himself between his own identity and taking on Obito's. He didn't want to be forced to see his teacher in a 12-year-old boy. Speaking of which, isn't your new team waiting for you? Sarutobi was smiling widely now, as if sharing an inside joke with the lazy Junin. If they are unfortunate enough to become my new team, Hokage-sama, replied Kakashi, they'll have to get used to it. A part of Kakashi was secretly hoping that this team would fail just like all the others he had tested. It would make his life much easier. But a larger part, including the blood-red eye he kept covered, desperately wished that this one team, the jubilant boy who wanted to be Hokage, the boy who had seen too many horrors for one so young, and the girl who blushed in front of her crush, would be the one team that Kakashi could pass. Keiru used his teeth to tear the price tag off of his new purchase and slipped them on immediately. The cloth of the gloves was tight and new, stretching over the back of his hands snugly. The fingers only reached to his second knuckle, but they covered what they needed to. Together with his long-sleeved shirt and dark pants, the only part of Keiru's skin still visible was his fingertips and his head. But he wasn't about to wear a mask. There was no need for it, and he didn't want to emulate Kakashi-sensei that much. He also had 2 new short-sleeved shirts in his pack and one sleeveless, just because it was warmer than he remembered in Hai no Kuni. They wouldn't be very helpful in hiding his seals, but Keiru had always been good at improvising. Admit it, Shino. I rocked. The voice, familiarly abrupt and boisterous, made Keiru spin around even though he had already recognized the owner. Your frequent boasts often led Kurenai-sensei to know of our position, returned the boy in sunglasses. His wide collar hid the lower part of his face from view, but the top of his head inclined slightly to the boy next to him. What? His companion had his hood pushed back to his shoulders, and a white pup rested comfortably on the mess of brown hair that graced his head. That wasn't my fault. Kiba-kun. A young girl with short dark hair ran up between the two boys and placed a hand shyly on the boy's arm. I am sure that Shishino meant NN no offense. She shot a pleading look to the boy in sunglasses, as if asking him to agree with her. Shino gave no indication that he was inclined to do so. Keiru let out a soft breath as soon as his lungs started working again. The girl had always been the peacemaker of the team. If she were a little more forceful, the boys might even look to her for direction. However, considering Hinata's personality, Keiru doubted it would happen. Suddenly, Kiba seemed to notice that he and his teammates were being watched. Dark, slitted eyes snapped up to meet Keiru's gaze indignantly. "Hey, what are you looking at?" Kiba demanded hotly. Keiru blinked and wondered how to respond. A boy who is going to lose his teammate and most of his family in 3 years didn't seem quite appropriate. "Kiba-kun," Hinata cried as she darted forward. "PP please, do not be rude." Her desperation gave courage to her stuttering tongue before she turned to the stunned redhead. "PP please. Forgive my teammate, sir." She inclined her head softly, bending at the waist in a proper bow. Keiru just stared. The girl in front of him seemed so small. He was used to seeing Hinata as the beautiful young woman he knew she would grow into. She was strong in her own right. Her attacks with the Juken were different than Neji's, but they were just as effective. Although, the stuttering had never really gone away. "Stop staring at her, ya bastard." Kiba's angry demand shook Keiru out of his reverie and brought his attention back to the rest of Team 8. Kiba was now standing by Hinata's shoulder, glaring furiously at Keiru. Meanwhile, Shino was silent in the face of Kiba's obvious rudeness. Granted, Shino was usually silent unless logic dictated that he speak up. But this felt more like an agreeing silence than a bothered silence. Keiru felt Shino's observant stare and knew that the core of Team 8 was already there. Shino and Kiba would do anything to protect their girl. Keiru smiled down at the kids then turned away. Those 3 would be fine. "Weirdo," he heard Kiba mutter from behind him. The opportunity was simply too good to pass up. "Like you're one to talk, dog boy." Keiru half turned back to Team 8 and smirked mischievously. Kiba's eyes widened in shock before suspicion and anger narrowed them again. Akamaru jumped from his perch, landing on all fours next to his master, his hair bristling as he shared Kiba's offense. "Kiba, Shino," a firm yet feminine voice interrupted the staring contest. Keiru's smile fell as he turned toward the voice. It was strange to see Kurenai in her regular Junin uniform instead of the civilian or maternity clothes she wore after Naruto had gotten back from his training trip. Throughout her pregnancy and even after Akio had been born, Kurenai had been expressly forbidden from participating in missions by Shikamaru, Kiba, and finally Naruto himself. None of them were willing to let Akio lose both of his parents. "My fault," Keiru quickly claimed, but he couldn't resist one last barb. "I shouldn't be teasing the kids, I guess." "Who are you calling kids, punk?" demanded Kiba, still riled. Kurenai stepped up and laid one hand on the boy's shoulder, stilling his actions. Keiru forced his face to remain calm as he inclined his head towards Kurenai the same way one would to an elder or higher-ranked ninja. Then, without a word, he didn't want to risk baiting Kiba again. He turned around and started walking down the road again. "Kiba," he heard Kurenai call from behind him. "You're a ninja now. You should exercise some self-restraint." "But, sensei, that guy was staring at Hinata," protested Kiba. "Like he was a perv or something." Kiba-kun," Hinata pleaded to deaf ears. Keiru dared to glance over his shoulder at Team 8 once more. Kurenai was leading the 3 new genin in the opposite direction, with Hinata walking close to Kiba, apparently still trying to convince him to calm down. Shino stood slightly apart from the others. He had never been one for physical contact, unless it was with his hive. And yet, when Shino had been declared missing in action after the fall of Konoha, Kiba had nearly exploded at Naruto that they needed to go back and find the quiet Aburame. Shikamaru had argued, quite expertly, that they all would have been killed if they returned to the Flaming City. After that, Kiba had latched firmly onto Hinata as his sole remaining teammate. Between Kiba's fierce protectiveness, the possessiveness of her cousin, and the large white dog that Akamaru grew into, Keiru had been surprised that Hinata ever had room to breathe. "Oi, Keiru." Keiru turned around, still caught somewhere between the fall of Konoha and his arrival in Suna, and saw a short, blonde, slightly dirty boy looking up at him with obvious concern. Naruto. How long had the boy been calling him? He hadn't heard anything. "Nay, you okay, Ni-san?" asked Naruto intently. Keiru's shoulders drooped. Whatever he had been planning before, like he had even had a plan, he couldn't leave the boy now. Naruto had already claimed him as a brother. He couldn't just leave Naruto alone again. He knew what kind of hell that was. Yeah, Keiru scratched the back of his head absently. This is what happens to me when I don't get enough ramen. One corner of his mouth turned up into a half smile, the best he could do under the circumstances. Then, his smile dropped as he saw three figures beyond Naruto. A man with wild, silver hair and a crooked Hite-8 stood over a girl with long pink hair and a dark boy with his hands shoved in his pockets and trying very hard to look like he didn't know his companions. Team 7. "Oh, I know," Naruto suddenly cried. "You gotta come to Ichiraku's." The boy grasped Keiru's wrist and started tugging. Keiru smiled in spite of himself. Damn, he missed this enthusiasm. But there was still something missing. "Hey, Gaki," he called softly. "Why don't we invite your friends?" Keiru nodded in the direction of Haruno Sakura and Uchiha Sasuke, who were studying the scene with varying degrees of interest. Sakura was openly curious while Sasuke was simply pulling his eyebrows together in his usual "you are too annoying to bother paying attention to" glare. Naruto frowned back at them and opened his mouth to protest. "I'll pay," offered Keiru before Naruto could say anything. Granted, the money bag he currently carried in his pack had been pulled from Naruto's top drawer, but the Gaki didn't know that. "Okay." Naruto shrugged agreeably. Anything for free ramen. He turned back to his teammates and waved vigorously. "Come on, Sakura-chan. Sasuke Teme. Don't call Sasuke-kun a Teme, Naruto no baka." Sakura's reaction was immediate as she took off chasing the Orange Clan ninja down the street towards the ramen stand. Sasuke followed with a shrug, as if he had decided that he didn't have anything better to do, anyway. Keiru hung back and looked at the man left behind. "Care to join us, sensei?" He struggled to keep his voice even. The last time he had seen Kakashi, the man had been bent over a dying Naruto, calling upon the Shinigami to take Kakashi's life in exchange for a seal that would keep Naruto alive. "Ma," sighed the Junin. "I think I'll pass." Kakashi's eye crinkled into a masked smile as he lifted one hand to wave at the departing genin and the redhead who stood stock still, watching the man who had been his first and last sensei walk away. Keiru tightened his grip on the strap of his pack and turned away as well. Naruto would never let him hear the end of it if he didn't show up to pay for the ramen. "See, Keiru Ni-san, this is the best ramen stand ever." Naruto's happy cry filled the small room of Ichiraku's. Sakura blushed and quickly glanced over her shoulder to see if anyone else in the noodle stand had noticed the boy's erratic behavior. This team was going to be a curse. It was just her luck that she had to be put on the same team as Uzumaki Naruto. She supposed it was her comeuppance for getting her wish to be on the same team as Uchiha Sasuke. Yeah, the teenager's soft agreement broke Sakura out of her thoughts. The redhead had done little but order a bowl of ramen and stare at the three brand new genin who were currently eating with him. Naruto was oblivious as usual, slurping his noodles with abandon. Sasuke seemed to be doing his best to pretend that he wasn't there at all. But Sakura watched as Naruto's Keiru Ni-san allowed his bright blue eyes to drift from Naruto's happy oblivion to Sakura's observant stare. She lowered her eyes quickly and told herself not to blush. It wasn't working very well. "I didn't know you had a brother, Naruto," Sakura commented, just to distract herself. To her surprise, it was Keiru who answered, as Naruto's mouth was filled with noodles. "Technically, the kid's my first cousin, once removed." His blue eyes crinkled as he smiled and reached out one hand to touzle Naruto's hair. Naruto swatted the hand away with a grumpy pout, and Sasuke actually looked up from his non-existent bowl of ramen. "You're his father's cousin?" the Uchiha asked with a slight frown. Keiru's eyes flickered to the dark-haired boy at the end of the counter, his smile suddenly dimmed. "His mother's," corrected Keiru. He quickly looked back to his ramen. "But I commend you on your observational skills, Uchiha. We were never introduced." Sasuke's frown deepened. Sakura realized that Sasuke was right. She only knew the redhead's name because Naruto had shouted it at the top of his lungs. And Keiru had never asked for theirs. MMPH? Keiru looked up from his bowl with several noodles hanging from his mouth. At that moment, Sakura thought that Keiru and Naruto looked very much alike, removed cousins or not. How did you know my name? Sasuke demanded, a touch of impatience in his voice. Keiru's eyes dulled slightly, and he looked back down at his miso ramen. Must be the eyes, he muttered. Sakura frowned in confusion. How would Sasuke's eyes make him recognizable? Maybe Keiru knew one of Sasuke's relatives, but Sakura had never seen the redhead before. And Naruto had certainly never talked about him. How did your survival training go, Gaki? Keiru beamed at his younger cousin, apparently forgetting about Sasuke and his eyes. It wasn't even survival. Naruto swallowed quickly to clear his mouth. His annoyance was clear even to the man behind the counter, and Sakura bent her head in embarrassment again. We were supposed to try and beat up Kakashi-sensei, and he wouldn't even feed us lunch. Sounds like you put them through a lot. Keiru faced the counter with a knowing smile. Sakura studied him curiously. She wasn't quite sure who he was addressing until Keiru glanced over his shoulder. Change your mind, sensei? Sakura and Sasuke turned as one towards the entrance to the ramen stand, where Kakashi stood lazily with his hands in his pockets. Naruto craned his neck to see what the commotion was about. The Hokage would like to see you, Keiru-kun, Kakashi announced in his lazy drawl. I'm not that young. Keiru grimaced slightly at the honorific and stood. Using one hand to dig through the pack he kept close by him, he withdrew a stuffed pouch that resembled a bloated amphibian. Keiru opened the pouch and turned it upside down. A handful of coins clattered to the counter loudly. Here's for the meal, OGG. Hey, Naruto cried indignantly. Gama-chan, that's my money. He turned an accusing finger onto Keiru. You said you were gonna treat us. Keiru just smiled triumphantly and tossed the frog pouch back to Naruto. Gimme a break, Gaki, he commanded. I was robbed on the way here. Keiru turned away from his cousin with a final wave and followed Kakashi into the street. Sakura shook her head in exasperation. This team really was going to be a curse. Keiru followed the Scarecrow Man into the Hokage's office and felt his lips twitch in his attempt to suppress the wide grin that threatened to break out on his face. Not only was the Hokage smiling at him, but a brunette Chunin with a familiar faint line of scar tissue across his nose was standing attentively beside Sandame's desk. Iruka glanced over the redhead suspiciously, studying the darkly clad young man and making Keiru wonder if the academy teacher already knew what Keiru was claiming to be. Keiru-san, Sarutobi greeted the young man. I hope staying with Naruto is working out well for you. Caught slightly off guard by the expectation of a response, Keiru quickly shifted his attention from his old sensei to his old Hokage. It's fine, Keiru responded hesitantly, not sure of what he was supposed to say. Naruto has been living on his own for some time, explained Sandame. He is very independent for his age. Keiru scoffed openly. Independent, when applied to children in a shinobi village, either meant that they refused to listen to their superiors or that they had no one to care whether they listened or not. But, above all, he wishes for someone to acknowledge him. Keiru looked up again with wide eyes at Sandame's statement. He remembered that being part of his introduction to his team, become Hokage so that everyone was forced to acknowledge his existence. So much for that dream. Meanwhile, both the Hokage and Iruka were looking at Keiru expectantly. Kakashi had whipped out his little orange book and was watching surreptitiously from his place slightly behind Keiru. They were waiting for his response, Keiru realized. But what could he say to convince them that he was a good guy? He had only shown up a few days ago. How could he explain that he would die to protect Konoha and his precious people? People who didn't even know the depths of his feelings. I'll stay with the Gaki, Keiru announced firmly. He glanced down suddenly as his voice dropped to a softer tone. I think, we could both use it. Well, Sandame suddenly took on a serious demeanor as he leaned forward and folded his hands on top of his desk. There is something else you should be aware of. Naruto has been through a lot in his life. Keiru listened with only half his brain as Sandame explained how the Kyuubi no Kitsune had attacked Konoha, how Yondaime had sacrificed his life to seal the demon, how Uzumaki Naruto was now the container for the fox, and how he was shunned because of it. Yeah, Keiru's simple murmur was more to prove that he was still listening than any kind of acknowledgement of a story he already had memorized. Naruto is forced to live with Kyuubi's shadow over him, continued Sarutobi, and all the villagers are aware of it. Despite his station as a genin and a loyal citizen of this village, they fear him. And people hate what they fear, Keiru interjected with a nod. I know. I understand, Hokage-sama. Better than you think. He curled his hands into fists and shoved them into his pockets, despite the fact that he knew his seals were covered. I see, said the Hokage, his eyes studying the young man in front of him. Keiru silently pleaded with whoever was in charge of these things that the old man wouldn't question him further about his empathy. He still had to figure out a way to explain the fact that he was a Jinchuriki to a demon that was already sealed. And his wasn't quite as secure as Naruto's. Well, then. A bright smile suddenly lit up Sandame's features. I think we should find you a more permanent place in the village. Are you a skilled worker? Ah. Keiru brought one hand out of his pocket to scratch at the back of his head. If he told many more lies, he was going to have a hard time keeping them all straight. I've never been anything but a ninja, Hokage-sama. Even when I was wandering, I hired myself out as a mercenary. It wasn't quite a half-truth, more like a truth without any specifics. Keiru had done shinobi work for pay. Most of his time after he had left Suna had been devoted to finding the remaining Akatsuki members and killing them, but he still needed money to live. So he had found people who wanted bandits scared away or protection on their own journeys. Basically D-ranked missions that wouldn't attract much attention. It at least gave him enough cash to pay for meals and lodging whenever he had been forced to stop at a town. Indeed? Sarutobi's voice showed nothing but curiosity. What rank did you hold in Whirlpool? I was Genin. Now that was true. He had always been too busy either training or fighting to take the Chunin exams after he had returned to Konoha, and afterwards, he was considered a missing nin and nobody cared about what rank he was. Just about what he could do. Well, you understand we can't automatically give you the same consideration without knowing a bit more about you. Sandame gestured briefly to the man beside him. Amino-san is a sensei at our shinobi academy. He will be able to test you. Iruka started suddenly at the attention. He had been staring at Keiru throughout the conversation, taking in the boy's words and reactions. The studious stare made Keiru slightly nervous, like he was an academy student caught in yet another prank again. Certainly, Hokage-sama. Iruka recovered quickly and moved to stand in front of Keiru. Obediently, Keiru performed each task as Iruka called for them. Henge, Kawarimi, and Bushin no Jutsu. He was tempted to perform his Oiroke no Jutsu instead of Henge, just for old time's sake, but that probably wouldn't go over well when he was trying to appear unsuspicious. Anything else for practicality, Iruka-sensei? Inquired Keiru with a smile as he dismissed his Bushin. He was lucky that his chakra control was better than it had been when he graduated. At least now he knew not to pour so much chakra into a simple Bushin. Iruka frowned at the title but continued with his job. How are you at taijutsu? Keiru frowned. There were several ways he could answer that one. He had never had the taijutsu ability that Lee or Neji had, but he had trained hard enough that he was probably above a normal genin. Then again, he was a 17-year-old genin, and that wasn't exactly normal, even in peaceful times. I'm all right. He finally shrugged. Very well. Sandame didn't contest Keiru's vague statement. You can demonstrate with Kakashi-san. Keiru glanced, wide-eyed, over his shoulder at the one-eyed Junin who was reading his dirty book nonchalantly. What? Keiru demanded, shoving a thumb at Kakashi. Me against him? Iruka-sensei is the only other qualified, explained the Hokage calmly. I'll take a Chunin over Sharingan Kakashi, Keiru snapped before the old man could finish. It took him all of 5 seconds to realize that Kakashi wasn't looking at his book anymore. Don't look at me like that, commanded the teenager when Kakashi continued to stare at Keiru instead of his Icha-Icha paradise. You've had a reputation since Iwa. You're not old enough to remember the war, returned Kakashi immediately. The speed of his response alone told Keiru that Kakashi was already suspicious. This fight was not going to be pleasant. Keiru closed his eyes and resigned himself to a weak retort. I told you, I'm not that young. Not with everything he had lived through. And now everything he was going to have to do just convince his precious people to let him stay in the village he would do anything to protect. Kakashi did not like Uzumaki Keiru. And as unfair as it was, it had much more to do with the young man's appearance than his behavior. Kakashi had only seen Kushina when she was with Minato, especially towards the end, when Kushina's pregnancy was obvious and she and Minato had been living together if only to avoid the questioning glances from the village. Still, he could see how the boy in front of him could be related to the redhead from Whirlpool. Same color hair, same chin, and the same curious look that roamed his surroundings as his eyes refused to stay focused on one thing for any extended period of time. It was annoying, and it was too convenient. Naruto was a Jinchuriki, a human with a biju sealed into him. In any place other than Konoha, the boy would probably be a weapon against the village's enemies. But Minato had wanted Naruto to be seen as a hero. Too bad the boy's skills were sorely lacking. Still, he had managed to learn and employ Kage Bushin no Jutsu after learning it in only one night. Kakashi had become genuinely curious about what kind of person Uzumaki Naruto would turn out to be. But, if another shinobi nation had sent this Keiru to pretend to be family, to worm his way into Naruto's life and create his own influence, then Konoha would be in danger of reaping the consequences of their negligence of Minato's wishes, no matter how Naruto developed. All this raced through Kakashi's mind as he stood unmoving on the small training field that the Hokage had led them to. Sandaime and the Chunin, Amino, stood to one side while Kakashi faced down Keiru in the middle of the field. Keiru was, at the moment, emitting a nervous energy as he glanced back and forth between Sandaime, Amino, and Kakashi, drumming his fingers against the skin on the back of his neck. So, Keiru finally sighed hesitantly, "Is someone gonna say, start?" Kakashi gave the boy an unseen smile from beneath his mask. This was far too easy. Start. The word had barely left Kakashi's mouth when he felt the soft pressure of a sharp blade at his neck. "Does this mean I win?" Keiru's voice came from behind the copy nen. Kakashi rolled his right eye back, squinting to peer over his shoulder. He was greeted with the sight of another Keiru, bearing a hopeful smile and holding a kunai to Kakashi's throat. "Nice trick," Kakashi noted calmly. The body behind him was solid. He could feel the knuckles grazing against his neck as the hand holding the kunai shifted slightly. And yet, Keiru still stood about 3 yards away from Kakashi in the training field. "When did you make the clone?" asked Kakashi. "After the Hokage gave me the kunai pouch," answered the Keiru in front of Kakashi. "You guys were too busy glaring at him to notice me. Was that the original in front of Kakashi, or was it the boy behind him?" Well, Kakashi had a method of finding out. "You didn't wait for the spar to start." "Ah." Keiru hung his head sheepishly. "Sorry about that. I didn't think it mattered in battle. I mean, an enemy ninja isn't gonna wait for you to stop yelling at him before he attacks." Kakashi registered the boy's words, but his mind was focused on the kunai at his throat. He felt the metal gently lift off his neck and hover in front of his shoulder. Technically, the weapon didn't pose the immediately threat that it had a moment ago, but a trained enemy would know exactly how to slash the blade as soon as he sensed Kakashi move. So the question was, what would Keiru, who claimed to be nothing more than a genin without a home, do? Kakashi jerked his elbow into the arm that supported the kunai, knocking it upwards, and turned to his right sharp enough to drive a left uppercut into the redhead's stomach. With a sudden oomph, Kakashi's fist was buried in a cloud of smoke. Apparently, Naruto was not the only Uzumaki who knew Kage Bushin no Jutsu. Ouch! Kakashi spun around to meet a charging Keiru. Correction. 5 charging Keirus. 2 of the identical figures broke off from the line and reached Kakashi first. One suddenly slammed his palm on the ground, bracing himself as his leg shot out in a low sweeping kick meant to knock Kakashi off balance. The second clone vaulted off the first's back and soared towards Kakashi, fist extended. Kakashi quickly launched into a flip, letting Keiru's kick pass under his airborne feet as one hand acted as a support on the ground. Kakashi's free arm curled into a fist and caught the higher clone in the stomach before Keiru's punch could connect. Enough with the punching in the gut, one of the shinobi surrounding Kakashi demanded hotly. "I'm still sore, ya know." Kakashi merely followed through his one-handed cartwheel until he stood with his back to his enemy. He felt more than saw 3 more Keirus approach him and turned around with his arms already raised. The first Keiru made a flying leap over Kakashi's head and left the second in line to attack the Junin head-on. Counting on the suspicion that the clone currently flying wouldn't be able to do anything in midair, Kakashi focused his attention on the 2 clones in front of him. One feinted to the right before attacking Kakashi's left side. With his Hite 8 still covering his left side, Kakashi's depth perception was a bit off, but it was a perspective he had had a long time to get used to. Kakashi's left arm came up to block the clone's punch before he dug out a kunai and flipped it over his shoulder. A small pop told him that he had dispelled another of the clones, but somehow 4 figures still remained. 2 flanked Kakashi on each side and 2 more stood in front of him, watching the battle intently. So, Keiru was using his cage bunshin to avoid getting close to the Junin. Mistake on Keiru's part. Kakashi flipped 2 more kunai into his palm and slashed through the clone on his right. Then he kicked away from the remaining clone and let the kunai sail towards the stragglers, watching as the 2 identical figures took on identical worried looks. Kakashi waited for one of them to leap out of the way, and he did not expect was the 2 clouds of smoke that resulted from the impact of the kunai. Wrong guess. The Keiru on Kakashi's left smirked. "I'm not scared to get my hands dirty." Keiru threw a haymaker at Kakashi's masked face. Kakashi frowned at such an obvious attack even as he raised his left arm to block it. Then, Keiru's right fist made contact with Kakashi's ribs. Kakashi stumbled back, taking advantage of the opportunity to put some distance between himself and his opponent. Dang, the kid could hit hard. Keiru just smiled and brought his hands together. Suddenly, Kakashi was once again faced with 5 opponents instead of just 1. What followed then was something that more resembled a game of tag than a spar. Kakashi dodged most of the blows successfully, but it soon became clear that Keiru wasn't even trying to hit the Junin. At least not in any traditional way. Instead, Keiru and his clones aimed for places on Kakashi's Junin vest, his stomach, his chest, or occasionally his shoulders. His punches never hurt, they were just taps, as if Keiru were trying to score points. And yet, if any of the clones had resorted to kunai, Kakashi would have at least 5 serious stab wounds by now. The Junin frowned beneath his crooked hite-8. The fight probably would be a lot easier if he had the time to unveil his Sharingan, but every time he reached for his headband, the clones would redouble their efforts. And no matter how many times Kakashi dispelled one clone, another took its place. There were never any more than 5 clones, but there were never any less. For Keiru to keep up this many cage bunshin for an extended period of time meant that his chakra reserves were above the normal genin level. Kakashi jerked to one side and thrust his kunai at the Keiru in front of him. Before the blade made contact, another clone grabbed Kakashi's target by the arm and spun him out of the way. "Whoa!" cried the Keiru, who suddenly had his back to Kakashi, thrown off balance by his clone's tug. Seizing the opportunity, Kakashi dug out a kunai and flicked it at Keiru's back. He could only guess that this one was the original since the clone had gone out of its way to save him. No sooner had the weapon left Kakashi's hand than the clone in front of him brought its hands together in front of its chin. Kakashi tensed, preparing for a jutsu attack, but the clone simply disappeared in a puff of smoke. Without even a twitch, Keiru ducked and somersaulted under the flying kunai. Kakashi was forced to dodge another punch from a clone as Keiru recovered and got to his feet. "Well, that was close," Keiru remarked. Kakashi's singular eye narrowed. Keiru had known that kunai was coming, but only because his clone had dispelled. In this regard, he had more mastery over the jutsu than Naruto did. Suddenly, Kakashi felt a hand grab his left wrist and attempt to twist it backwards. As he tried to lunge into the twist, attempting to relieve some of the pressure, a second clone grabbed his right arm and held him in place. With his arms held by clones and a smiling Uzumaki standing in front of him, Kakashi had a sudden sense of déjà vu. So, when he saw a kunai fly towards his chest, he repeated his actions from that morning. The Kawarami placed him behind Keiru, but only for about the space of the sudden dispelling of the clone that Kakashi had left behind. Then, Keiru spun around and launched a second kunai at the gray-haired Junin. "I gotta find some more Doden jutsus," Kakashi heard Keiru mutter as his clones surrounded him. "You're a little bit slippery." Kakashi dusted himself off and stood up straight. With all his identical opponents lined up in front of him, Kakashi took a moment to lift a hand to his hide-8. "You're a little bit unpredictable," returned Kakashi as his fingers wrapped around the familiar metal across his eye. The statement could possibly be seen as a compliment. It was certainly the reason that Kakashi was planning on relying on his Sharingan. But unpredictability also made even an ally dangerous to his comrades. Strangely, a wide, knowing grin stretched across Keiru's face, as if he shared an inside joke with his clones. Sensei, you have no idea. Keiru and his clones charged once again. Kakashi's muscles tensed as he peeled his Hite 8 back from his right eye and prepared for an attack. Suddenly, a pained cry filled the small field. Both of Kakashi's mismatched eyes widened as Keiru's clones summarily dispelled and left the boy alone among the dissipating smoke. Keiru doubled over, wrapping his arms around his stomach and falling to his knees. Quickly, Kakashi peered at the boy with his spinning Sharingan. He couldn't see any hand signs or chakra movement that suggested this was a trap, but they had just been talking about unpredictability. Kakashi took out another kunai and flicked it towards the boy, half expecting another clone to spring up and take the blow. Instead, the kunai grazed Keiru's right shoulder with enough force to send the young man to his knees, still clutching at his stomach. Kakashi dashed forward, a last kunai already in his hand. He delivered a swift kick to Keiru's chest immediately and stood poised over the young man a moment later, Keiru on his back. "I think that will do," Sandaime announced briskly. Kakashi froze with his kunai hovering over his opponent's heart. Keiru seemed unaffected by his imminent death. He simply raised one gloved hand and batted Kakashi's kunai away as he turned from his back to his side, groaning painfully as he did. A harsh cough racked the boy's throat, followed by a couple dry heaves. Despite himself, Kakashi frowned in concern. Unpredictable was certainly a word that fit Uzumaki Keiru. One minute he was able to force Sharingan Kakashi to reveal his trademark eye, and the next he was incapacitated by stomach pains. But Keiru seemed undeterred. He pushed himself to a sitting position, one hand supporting his weight as the other clutched at his stomach. "Guess I'm not as recovered as I thought," muttered the boy with a sheepish grin. "Well, I have seen enough." Kakashi and Keiru both looked up as the Hokage made his way over to the pair with Amino trailing behind the elderly man. Keiru braced one hand on his knee and pushed himself to his feet unsteadily. Kakashi faced his Hokage alongside Keiru but kept his Sharingan eye open, just for the sake of details. Sarutobi Hiruzen unclasped his hands from behind his back and adjusted the pipe in his mouth with one hand as the other dipped into his large cloak. "Congratulations, Uzumaki Keiru," Sandaime declared as he pulled a Hite 8 from within the folds of his robe. "As of now, you shall be considered a genin of Konoha." Kakashi watched Keiru's eyes widen before settling into a kind of amused pride. Keiru let loose a loud, triumphant laugh as he took the headband from the Hokage and grinned widely. His blue eyes fixed themselves on the headband, and Keiru became subdued just as suddenly as he had been exultant. He used the pad of his thumb to trace around the spiraled symbol of the leaf, then clutched the metal band tightly in his fist. "Arigato, Hokage-sama," murmured the boy quietly. He looked up to meet the old man's eyes, gave him a tentative smile and a nod, and turned again towards the village, walking confidently with his new symbol of status held tightly in one hand. Silently, Kakashi tugged his headband over his left eye again and noted that Keiru hadn't even acknowledged the wound that he had received in their spar. Iruka watched the boy named Uzumaki Keiru walk back towards Konoha with a growing sense of unease in the pit of his stomach. "Hokage-sama, are you sure about this?" he couldn't help but ask the older man beside him. "His taijutsu was unconventional," remarked Sandaime, "but admirable. And he did seem to be working hard." Kakashi took another step towards the other two men on the field, tucking his hands into his pockets as he did so. He knows how to utilize Kage Bunshin fully. The man sounded just as lazy as Iruka had ever heard him. And he knows how to fight. Iruka frowned at the last comment. He was still dubious of this man being Naruto's sensei. "That was just proved," protested Iruka. "He knows taijutsu. He knows how to fight," Kakashi repeated, stressing his words this time. His lone eye remained on the Hokage instead of Iruka. His instincts were good, and he was comfortable in his stance. "He's been fighting for a long time, maybe all his life." "He has already explained that he has always been shinobi," replied Sandaime calmly. "Keiru has shown nothing to indicate that he would be unfaithful to the village that holds his only family. But how can we know that Keiru is actually related to Naruto?" Iruka's objection was heated and the basis for his main concern about Uzumaki Keiru. If he's just trying to get something out of this, Naruto will be crushed. Iruka didn't allow himself to suggest that Keiru might be interested in Naruto simply because of the Kyuubi, even to two men whom he knew were aware of the situation. Iruka still remembered Naruto's fear and anger that night with Mizuki, when he had first learned the truth. If someone else, someone that Naruto might learn to trust, turned out to be another traitor, Iruka wasn't sure if Naruto could overcome it. Sandaime slowly sucked on the end of his pipe, making the leaves in the bowl burn brightly temporarily before he breathed out again. I understand both of your concerns. His nod at once included both Kakashi and Iruka. But you seem to be forgetting another factor. Iruka frowned at the Hokage and wondered if he should have voiced his opinion more clearly. He might not have been Anbu, but Iruka knew he was one of the few who actively looked out for Naruto's well-being. Keiru is alone, explained the Hokage. For many people, such loneliness can break them. Of course, the effects are worse in shinobi. If Naruto can convince Keiru that there are some things worth fighting for and worth protecting, perhaps whatever hardships Keiru has seen will diminish in his eyes. Iruka stared at the ground in front of him and reviewed what he knew about Keiru. The Hokage had said that he was the cousin of Naruto's mother, although no name was mentioned, and had been wandering alone for some time. Iruka knew what it was to be alone, but to have no roots as well, no sense of familiarity. It's a risk, Hokage-sama, Kakashi interposed, capturing Iruka's attention again. I am aware. The Hokage nodded once, solemnly. But Keiru will be monitored closely by a Junin. He looked up suddenly at the one-eyed Junin instructor. If you're that worried, Kakashi, I can put an Anbu on the boy as well. Iruka shook his head slightly, wondering if the Hokage was joking or not. But I think he deserves a chance to know his family, finished Sarutobi. Silence reigned in the open field for a moment before Kakashi pulled a small orange book out of his pocket. Kakashi nodded and left the field with a friendly wave at the two men left behind. When will you have to return to your students, Iruka-san? Iruka glanced at the Hokage, slightly nervous at the question. A few weeks, Hokage-sama, he answered honestly. I admire your work with them. Sandaime smiled at the much younger man. The young generation always gives me hope for the future of this village. With that final wise adage, the Hokage turned and followed his own path back to the Hokage Tower. Iruka sighed and glanced back to where he could just see Keiru's back disappearing into the village of Konoha. The youth gave Iruka hope as well, but was it wrong for him to be concerned about one student in particular if that student had no one else to worry about him? Naruto cursed his teammate, his coordination, and his teammate again, just for good measure, as he stomped home after a very long day. After Keiru had left the ramen stand, Sasuke had made a comment about not trusting the red-headed teenager. Of course, Naruto had taken offense, and the argument had downgraded from there into a shouting match. At least Naruto had been shouting. The worst part, however, was when Naruto had lunged for Sasuke, missed by at least a foot, and knocked Sakura's ramen into her lap. Which led to a beatdown courtesy of the rage of a woman who had just had her outfit ruined by stupidity. Naruto had spent the rest of the afternoon, and some of the evening, trying to apologize to Sakura and blaming Sasuke for the mess. Come supper time, she still hadn't forgiven him and had claimed that she needed to go home and Naruto had better not follow her or she would scream harassment. So Naruto, tired and disappointed, trudged through his door and into his apartment. Hey, Gaki. Naruto jumped at the voice. He was not used to being greeted by anything other than his own boasts when he came home. But now, his weird red-headed cousin was sitting cross-legged on the floor, shirtless and staring down at something on the floor in front of him as he welcomed Naruto home. Unwilling to admit that he had been scared in his own home, Naruto immediately went on the defensive. Stop calling me that, the boy demanded, brandishing one fist at the redhead, who kept his eyes down. Come to think of it, Keiru was partially to blame for Naruto's mess as well. If he hadn't left, Sasuke would definitely have seen how cool he was. At least, that was Naruto's hope. Naruto's indignation quickly left in favor of curiosity. With his shirt off, Keiru left his skin open for study. What skin there was to see, anyway. Most of his body was covered with funny patterns that Naruto had never seen before. They stretched around his stomach up to his ribcage and danced up his arms to his elbows, and there was a thin pink line, like a scar, on his right shoulder. Keiru sat with an ink block in front of him, one shallow dish filled with thick black ink. He took a kunai in one hand and pressed the blade to the pad of his left thumb, slicing the flesh. Naruto's eyebrows knitted together underneath his Hite-8. Hey, what are you doing? He asked, slightly concerned now that his cousin was bleeding. Staying alive, Keiru answered shortly. He leaned forward to hold his wounded thumb over the dish of ink and let the blood drip into the blackness. He kept his eyes on his work even as Naruto stepped forward, curious. Keiru pressed his forefinger to his thumb suddenly to stop the bleeding and traded his kunai for a brush with a worn wooden handle. Naruto ran his tongue over his lips and watched closely as Keiru used his brush to mix the blood in with the ink. Then, the older boy lifted the ink-laden brush and twisted his left hand so that he stared at the patterned skin on his forearm. Only then did he look up to meet Naruto's gaze. "They're seals," explained Keiru. He looked back down and began tracing the black designs over with his brush. "They keep the demon in me from killing me." Naruto's eyes flew from the brush drawing its smooth strokes to Keiru's face, which was already blank with concentration. "Demon?" breathed the boy. Naruto hadn't forgotten about his state of being or his recently acquired knowledge about what was sealed inside him. He just couldn't figure out what it meant yet. He knew he wasn't the same as the demon he carried. Iruka-sensei's words alone would have been enough to convince the young genin, but there was also the fact that Naruto thought he would have had a lot more power if he were really a giant fox demon. But he had never considered the possibility that someone else might be in the same situation as him. Keiru began slowly as he painted his skin. "I guess it's mostly Yuki now, but..." Keiru's explanation halted when the teenager looked up and met Naruto's eyes, which were still wide with the realization that his cousin was more like him than he knew. Keiru snapped his mouth shut suddenly as his cobalt eyes pierced into Naruto's nervous gaze. "It'll get better," declared Keiru. His voice had dropped to a lower register, so that Naruto had to lean in closer in order to hear him. "You'll prove them wrong about you, and they'll stop looking at you with those eyes." Naruto suddenly stood up straight again and stared at his cousin, wide-eyed. "Wah!" was all that left Naruto's open mouth. How had Keiru known about the looks that Naruto got? Did people with demons in them get the same looks everywhere? Hokage-sama told me about Kyuubi. Keiru's eyes flickered down to the ink between him and the boy before he looked back up. Blue eyes were burning now, fierce in their color with determination. "It'll get better, Naruto. I promise. And I never go back on my word." Naruto believed him. He couldn't help it. He believed Keiru. That things would get better. "Yeah," Naruto agreed. He drew the back of his hand over the skin beneath his nose, feigning an itch. For some reason, his nose was runny all of a sudden. Naruto sniffed loudly and looked back at his cousin, who was busy with his brush again. "So, why are you painting your arms?" he asked, some of his usual exuberance returning. "The demon's chakra is tied into my own," answered Keiru, not looking up, "but it's not supposed to be. These seals suppress it enough so that it doesn't burn through my chakra coils." Naruto nodded, even though he wasn't sure he understood. If Keiru's demon wasn't supposed to be inside him, how did it get there in the first place? And how could chakra burn through your coils? Would something like that happen to Naruto? He grimaced as thoughts of melting skin flashed through his mind. "You wanna help?" Naruto's head jerked up at Keiru's sudden offer. His older cousin had apparently finished his left arm and was holding out his brush towards Naruto. Hesitantly, Naruto knelt down on the floor in front of Keiru and took the brush between his fingers. "What do I do?" Naruto looked at Keiru timidly. "Just trace over the lines." Keiru balled his right hand into a fist and held it out to Naruto, exposing the black seals on his skin. "And don't mess up." Naruto gulped at the final admonition but grit his teeth and bent over the proffered arm. He stuck his tongue between his lips and almost bit down on the soft muscle in his concentration as he slowly drew the brush over the already existing lines. No one had ever trusted him with something like this before. He was helping to keep his cousin alive. Naruto's attention did not waver until he realized that his brush needed more of the bloodied ink. "The Hokage made me a genin today," Keiru announced as Naruto loaded the brush with ink. I can help pay for the apartment if you want." Naruto almost shouted a happy, "Hell, yeah." The rent for his apartment took up a large chunk of the allowance he got from Hokage Gigi, and he didn't know how much the pay for missions would help if all he did was chase evil cats. But his voice suddenly died at the look on Keiru's face. It was hesitant and guarded. Like Keiru was afraid that Naruto would say no. Naruto glanced back down at the seals on the larger, stronger arms in front of his, and he wondered if Keiru had been hated. Maybe Keiru had been alone, too. But Naruto didn't know how to say that Keiru didn't have to be alone anymore, that he had Naruto now. Not when Naruto felt as alone as Keiru looked. So, Naruto settled for doing the best job on Keiru's seals that he possibly could, better than anyone else could do. Because this was family, and family should stick together, shouldn't they? Yeah, Naruto murmured his agreement as the black line of ink wound around Keiru's arm smoothly. Keiru stood on the flat roof of the apartment complex, letting the night air dry out his freshly painted arms. Naruto had already been sent to bed, with surprising obedience, after a quick meal of instant ramen. The only supper either of them could fix in such a short time. A sardonic smile crossed his face as Keiru wondered if he should learn how to cook. Or at least make Naruto learn how to cook since he would be the one living. Keiru swallowed hard and glanced down at his arms. The fight with Kakashi had been the second time in the 3 days since he had woken up in the hospital that his seals had hurt so badly that he found it hard to function. And that wasn't counting the debilitating episode against the robbers that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. At any rate, there was only one conclusion that Keiru could see: his condition was still deteriorating. The seals on his arms were probably going to have to be strengthened more often now. But, unless he found someone who knew about seals and Yuki on the level that Yondaime had, nothing about his situation was going to change. Keiru was still going to die. Not that he was bothered by the revelation. Keiru had been planning on dying ever since he had needed the suppressing seals on his arms. That was why he had been traveling on his own. He had to accomplish his goal of killing the last Uchiha so that the remaining rookies and loyalists to Konoha would have one less obstacle to worry about when they took back their home. But now, maybe he could just go out and kill Orochimaru and the rest of Akatsuki so that none of the failures in his life would visit this Konoha. That would be easiest, wouldn't it? It wasn't like anyone in Konoha trusted him, between Iruka and Kakashi. The Hokage hadn't said anything, but if Kakashi was suspicious then Sandaime sure as hell would be. Keiru blinked once as a different thought occurred to him. He looked down again, turning his right palm upwards to look at seals carefully drawn by a certain 12-year-old blonde. Keiru had told himself that he was offering Naruto the brush because Keiru wasn't that good at painting with his left hand. But that wasn't the real reason, and deep down, Keiru knew it. He liked being with Naruto. He couldn't consider himself the same person as the smaller blonde. There were too many years and far too many deaths between them. But, looking at Naruto, Keiru found the first of a long list of reasons to stay in Konoha. Uchiha Sasuke was in Konoha. He was 12 years old and an arrogant bastard, but he was a part of Team 7. Sandaime Hokage was still alive and ruling the village. Kurenai didn't have the lines of worry and fear that had been permanently etched into her face. Keiru curled his right hand into a fist. He could change things here. Now, if Naruto could be stronger than Keiru had been. If Orochimaru didn't give Sasuke that stupid mark in the Chunin exams. If Sandaime didn't die. So many ifs, and not enough time. Never enough time. He could change things. He might not have much time, but in the time that he had, he would change things. It didn't matter if Keiru never lived to save the world. Uzumaki Naruto was the one who wanted to be Hokage, anyway. Keiru smiled at the faces on the mountain that gazed imposingly over the village. His village. He turned away and walked back down the wall to the window that led into the small apartment he now shared with his family. Don't pull that one. That's my fennel. Keiru frowned as he snatched his hand away from the plant he had been about to uproot. It looked pretty much like a weed to him. But how was he supposed to tell the difference between weeds and plants that didn't have flowers on them? Although he supposed that was why the wrinkled old lady was currently standing over his shoulder, scrutinizing his every move. Not to mention the Junin in sunglasses watching Keiru like a hawk. Keiru wondered who was keeping an eye on Konohamaru now that Ebisu was regulated to babysitting the latest addition to Konoha Genin. Swiping the back of his arm across his forehead to clear it of sweat, Keiru reached down to a plant that looked fairly similar to one he had previously yanked and pulled it. When he didn't hear any cries of protest from the old lady, he shook the dirt from the roots and tossed the weed aside. He had forgotten how mindlessly boring D-ranked missions could be. Keiru had lived through countless attacks from everything from bandits to crazy take over the world through Biju missing Nen. And now he was pulling weeds for a picky old hag. Not to mention the fact that he was sweating buckets under his dark, long-sleeved shirt that covered his skin. The things he did for his precious people. A small smile crossed Keiru's face as he pulled another weed and tossed it onto his growing pile. Surprisingly, the past few weeks of D-ranked missions hadn't been a total loss. At least Naruto had someone to sympathize with him when complaining about how boring it was to chase cats and patrol the village walls and carry groceries for old ladies. And D-ranked missions hardly took up any chakra. Keiru hadn't had a problem with his stomach, or more accurately his seals, since that last spar with Kakashi. The only drawback was that Keiru knew his condition was getting serious if his seals needed to be strengthened every time he used chakra. He would need to find a way around that, and soon, if he was going to survive long enough to do anything. Maybe he could ask Naruto to give him a hand with that. The brat had quickly fallen into the habit of asking his Keiru ni-san every night if needed his seals painted. A part of Keiru was glad that he could refuse Naruto, given that the need to strengthen his seals would mean he was that much closer to death. But a larger part of him saw the disappointed flinch that Naruto wasn't that good at hiding yet. Naruto would turn away with tight shoulders, silently accepting the fact that his older brother figure didn't need him, and Keiru would demand where he was going when Keiru had so much to teach him. So far, Keiru had worked mostly on the gaps in Naruto's knowledge. They had gone over basic history and ninja ranks, using as many examples of Naruto's acquaintances that Keiru could think of. They both retained things better when they could connect what they were learning to personal experience. Keiru hadn't even gotten to the finer points of Kage Bushin, but he was still unsure about that training. Kage Bushin was a kinjutsu for a reason. Each copy of the person had its own experiences and memories released whenever it dispelled. But too much information, and the originator's brain would fry. There was a more technical term for it, of course, but Keiru couldn't remember what Sakura had called it. "Hey," Keiru called over his shoulder suddenly. "Would Daya want me to do when I'm done?" "Why?" Ebisu frowned at the boy. "'Cause I'm done." Keiru smirked at Ebisu's confusion. The Junin stepped closer and looked over his work suspiciously. Keiru grimaced. Did the guy think that he would be a slacker just because he was supposed to be related to Naruto? Keiru was offended, or at least he could pretend to be. He was good at that. "I suppose the boy does good work," cracked out the old lady, eyeing her garden surreptitiously. Keiru shot a triumphant, "So there, look at Ebisu," that quickly disappeared when the old lady took out a handful of crinkled bills and handed them over to the Junin. Keiru watched the lady retreat into her house before he turned his attention back on the closet pervert. "I do all the work and you get paid?" Keiru grumbled as he got to his feet and dusted the dirt off his knees. "You don't understand the economics of this village yet," Ebisu replied snippily. Keiru scoffed and shook his head. He knew far more about this village than anyone thought. Not that he could afford to tell anyone that. At any rate, he knew what would happen to the money. Those who hired ninja paid the village proper, then the funds were distributed to the ninja who completed the mission according to the rank of the mission. "Hokage-sama needs our mission report," the Junin reminded his shorter companion. Keiru just turned around with a lazy wave. "Have fun with that." He started walking away until he knew Ebisu would be fuming behind him. Only then did Keiru look back over his shoulder at the flustered Junin. "What?" Keiru's tone was a mixture of demand and surprise. "You make genin fill out mission reports in this village? Hard asses." Keiru turned again and dashed away, taking full advantage of Ebisu's incredulity to escape. He threaded his way down a crowded street before diving into a small dango stand, leaving Ebisu chasing a Kage Bushin that had instructions to dispel as soon as possible. Keiru didn't want to waste any chakra. The redhead slipped his gloved hands in his pockets and stepped casually out of the stand. The corners of his mouth lifted easily as he started walking in the opposite direction as the flustered Ebisu. It was only mid-afternoon. Keiru wondered if Kakashi was still as late as ever. "He's late again," grumbled Naruto as he sat beneath the tree. "What kind of stupid teacher did we get stuck with? First, he gets hit with a falling eraser, then he shows up late for everything." "Naruto," Sakura snapped a reprimand at the boy. "Kakashi-sensei is a Junin. You should show some respect." Resting his back on the railing of the bridge that crossed the river that ran through the northern part of Konoha, Sasuke scoffed at the antics of his teammates. Secretly, though, he agreed with the loud-mouthed boy. If he was just going to sit and wait around for his sensei, he would rather do so at home, where he could practice his shuriken throws. "Hey, kids!" Sasuke's head shot up at the friendly call. A redhead dressed in dark colors from his collar to his ankles waved at Team 7 as he approached the bridge. He wore a Konoha Hite 8 tied around his left bicep and a shuriken holster on his thigh, and he was sporting the same grin that Sasuke had seen frequently on Naruto. "Hey, Keiru ni-san." Naruto returned the greeting happily as he got to his feet to greet his first cousin, once removed. Sasuke gazed at the new arrival calmly. He was still unsure of how he felt about Keiru. Sasuke, like most of the students at the academy, had never thought twice about Naruto's family. The Dobi was an orphan and always had been. He certainly wasn't the only one in the shinobi village, but he did get the most attention. It was as if people looked at Naruto and saw the epitome of what the shinobi life could leave behind. Naruto was alone. He was like Sasuke in that regard. At least he had been until Keiru inexplicably showed up. Yesterday, Naruto had explained that Keiru hadn't known about Naruto's existence, so he was excused for never coming to care for his family. But something was still off about the red-haired shinobi. "Kakashi-sensei's late again," Naruto announced loudly, meeting Keiru on the bridge, just in front of Sasuke's resting place. "What are you doing here?" Keiru slipped his hands into his pockets as he shrugged easily. "I finished my mission early and decided to check on you, Gaki," he answered. Naruto scowled at the nickname, but Keiru was already looking over the top of the blonde's head to the tree behind Naruto. "Hi, Sakura-chan." Sasuke glanced at Sakura in time to see her bow politely to the teenager. "Good afternoon, Keiru-san," she responded. Keiru just chuckled and raised a hand to rest at the back of his neck. "You don't have to be that polite, Sakura-chan." Keiru's light eyes squinted shut as he gave the young kunoichi an amused smile. "Not to me. You'd rather be called Keiru-kun?" Sasuke demanded. Keiru's eyes snapped to Sasuke. He had that look again. As if Keiru were looking at Sasuke and seeing someone else. Sasuke was sure that Keiru had never been in Konoha before. Naruto probably would have said something if that were true. And yet Keiru had recognized Sasuke as an Uchiha, even though Sasuke didn't have the Sharingan yet. Sheesh. Keiru suddenly turned away from Sasuke and sighed. His hand dropped to his side again, but he didn't say anything else. Or answer Sasuke's question. "Hey, what kind of mission did you have, Keiru ni-san?" demanded Naruto. "Just D-ranked. Pulling weeds and helping an old lady." A sly smile appeared on the older nin's face. Maybe Kakashi-sensei needs extra money, so he's taking D-ranked missions, and that's why he's late all the time. Naruto's eyes grew wide at the implications. "Really? You think?" Sasuke scoffed again. Naruto was too excited, or simply too stupid, to see the amused twinkle in Keiru's eyes. "Dobi." The reaction was immediate. "What did you call me, Teme?" Naruto whirled to face Sasuke with one fist upraised. Sasuke glowered at the boy and waited for the blow, eager to do something other than wait. Suddenly, a larger hand wrapped around Naruto's fist, halting him in mid-swing. "I got a better idea, Gaki." A corner of Keiru's mouth curved upward as he looked down on his cousin, ignoring Sasuke. "You think you can hit me? Huh?" was Naruto's articulate response. "My missions are boring, and I need someone to train with," explained Keiru. He released Naruto's fist, but the blonde had completely forgotten about his tiff with Sasuke by this time. "You wanna spar?" Naruto paused for a moment before breaking out into a wide grin. "Yeah," he agreed happily and danced his way back across the bridge, followed by a smiling Keiru. Sasuke scoffed at the two Uzumaki's behavior and leaned back against the bridge again with his arms folded across his chest. He ignored the scuffling sounds of fighting that now came from the small open area just beyond the tree across the bridge and stared at the running stream beneath him instead. He wasn't strong enough. He supposed that he had known that all along, but during his initial fight with Kakashi, just before the man had declared them unfit to be ninja, Sasuke realized that the gap in his strength was more prominent than Sasuke had first thought. He had ended up buried to his neck by a simple Doden just you, and even worse, he had almost spilled his worst memory to Sakura of all people. Killing Itachi was his goal, his burden to bear, and no one else's. He couldn't afford to let anyone know that he was still haunted by his past, even if most days the fear and loneliness had hardened into the raw passion of an avenger. It was something that could be seen as weakness. And Sasuke refused to be weak. "Stop getting so frustrated," The command jerked Sasuke's thoughts away from his brother, and he looked over at the sparring match. Naruto stood in the field with 5 other clones, but it was hard to tell which was the real body since all 6 of the figures were panting and sweaty. Keiru, on the other hand, faced Naruto from about 3 yards away, alone and untouched. He didn't even have a scratch on him. Curious despite himself, Sasuke straightened and walked towards where Sakura sat beneath the tree, watching the ordeal. "The dobi hasn't hit him yet?" Sasuke demanded. Sakura looked up with a slight blush across her cheekbones. Sasuke ground his teeth together and fixed his eyes on the 2 combatants rather than his kunoichi teammate. It was annoying the way she fawned over him and blushed whenever he was around. "Anyo, Naruto has hit Keiru-kun twice already," answered Sakura finally. But Keiru was just a clone. So, Keiru knew Kage Bushin no Jutsu as well. Sasuke wondered how useful this technique was supposed to be. It was obviously higher level. Had Naruto learned it from Keiru originally? "You get so frustrated, you can't see where I am," Keiru explained to his cousin in calm tones. "Concentrate. You're worse than Kakashi-sensei," one of the Narutos retorted. "At least I don't read porn while I'm teaching." Keiru just smiled then beckoned with one hand. "Come on, try again." Naruto growled and charged, all 6 of him. Keiru waited patiently until 2 of Naruto's clones reached the teenager first. One was dispensed with by a quick jab to the stomach while the other received a kick to the teeth. Keiru jumped backwards to avoid an obvious haymaker from another Naruto and flicked a kunai at his attacker. "Hey!" Naruto shouted as the clone disappeared into a cloud of smoke. "This is taijutsu. No weapons allowed. You should have said that before, Gaki." Keiru looked unrepentant as he stood in front of the 3 remaining opponents. "Besides, I didn't hit you." The excuse seemed to do little to comfort Naruto, who took out a shuriken of his own and threw it at his cousin. Keiru jumped over the weapon and raced for Naruto. Suddenly, Keiru leapt over 2 of the Narutos in front of him. He reached out and grabbed each one by the head while he was still in midair and forced them to headbutt. The 2 clones dissipated, and Naruto was left alone. Indignant, he turned around to face Keiru as he landed and pulled his fist back for a blinding blow. "Nope." Keiru almost sounded apologetic as he sidestepped Naruto's punch and grabbed the boy's collar. Using his larger size and longer reach, Keiru pulled Naruto off his feet and launched him towards the tree. Naruto flew through the air, flipped once, and crashed into the ground beside Sasuke, the back of his head slamming against the hard earth. Sasuke lifted one corner of his mouth into a smirk. HMPH. Dobi. However disappointed Sasuke was with his own growth, at least he felt secure in the knowledge that he couldn't be worse than Naruto. His smirk grew slightly wider at Naruto's standard reaction when the blonde snapped his head around with a lock of absolute indigence. "Shut up, Uchiha." Sasuke shifted to glare at Keiru, who was standing in the middle of the open area with his arms folded. The redhead was frowning, apparently displeased with the scene that met his eyes. "You couldn't do any better." Keiru's statement wasn't a form of bragging. He sounded like Kakashi, just explaining how weak Sasuke still was. "You're comparing me to that loser?" demanded Sasuke as he grit his teeth together. He was not weak. Keiru studied Sasuke seriously for a moment before one corner of his mouth turned up in a knowing smile. "Yeah, I'd say the similarities are all there," Keiru declared and summarily turned his back on Sasuke. Sasuke balled his hands into fists, hot anger boiling up from his gut. He was not weak. He refused to be weak. "Sasuke-kun," Sakura shouted, leaping to her feet. Sasuke ignored her worried cry and ran at Keiru's back. Keiru just kept walking calmly before he launched himself into the air. Sasuke tracked the taller nin's path of motion easily. He could see Keiru's body as the taller boy arched over Sasuke's head, twisted in midair, and landed behind him, facing the angry genin. Sasuke's lips peeled back to bare his teeth as he quickly changed directions and launched a fist directly at his opponent. Keiru just swiped one hand across his body, capturing Sasuke's wrist as he pushed his fist to the side. The larger boy twisted the wrist he held easily and used Sasuke's own momentum to turn him. Suddenly, Sasuke's arm was twisted behind his back and held there by one of Keiru's hands as the other was braced on Sasuke's shoulder. Keiru leaned over the shorter boy's shoulder so that his mouth lined up with Sasuke's ear. Am I going slow enough for y'all? Demanded the victor. Sasuke let out a frustrated cry and tore away from Keiru's grip. The fact that Keiru released him before he used any escape techniques only further angered Sasuke. He spun around and faced Keiru again. This time Keiru charged. Sasuke avoided the first blow and was forced to go on the defensive. He blocked, he dodged, but Keiru kept pounding at him. After a few minutes, Sasuke noticed something. Every so often, Keiru's offense would leave an opening. His arm would linger above his head for just a second, or his fist would remain cocked back for longer than it needed to, leaving Sasuke an opportunity that he wasn't sure if he should take. Sasuke, Keiru muttered with a frown, "You're better than that." Sasuke bared his teeth and thrust his fist into one of the openings Keiru provided. Before his punch could connect, Keiru's hand came up to slap Sasuke's hand. Not hard, but enough to force his fist down a few inches into a new position where his punch would connect with Keiru's ribs. Or at least it would have if Sasuke hadn't dropped his fist out of shock. What the heck was Keiru trying to do? The fight continued with several repeats of Keiru's performance. Using slaps or taps, Keiru would move Sasuke's punches or kicks into positions where they would do more damage than Sasuke originally planned. And yet, Sasuke still couldn't hit the genin. Then, Sasuke saw Keiru's eyes flicker to their audience by the tree. "Sasuke!" Naruto cried, more in worry than anger. Capitalizing on the momentary distraction, Sasuke planted his feet and launched a punch right at Keiru's face. Keiru's eyes turned back to Sasuke just in time to catch a fist across his jaw. Keiru's head snapped to the side with the force of the blow, and Sasuke smirked triumphantly. Still frozen in his place, Keiru lifted his eyes and muttered two words. "Hey, Hitaki." Surprised, Sasuke turned towards the tree. Naruto and Sakura were on their feet, accompanied by a Junin with only one eye showing and a small orange book in one hand. "Ma, are you lost, Keiru-kun?" asked Kakashi. Keiru lifted one hand and rubbed his thumb against the edge of his mouth where a bruise was quickly forming. "Your students were bored, so we were sparring," he responded easily. His hand dropped again as he smiled at Kakashi. "See what you miss when you're late, Kakashi-sensei." Sasuke studied the teenager in front of him. Keiru's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He was hiding something, but Sasuke didn't know if it was a reaction to Kakashi or disappointment that Sasuke had managed to hit him. Kakashi didn't respond much to Keiru's statement. "I think someone was looking for you." Sasuke glanced over Kakashi's shoulder to see a man in dark clothes and sunglasses standing on the bridge, looking very displeased with something. Or someone. Yeah. Keiru rubbed the back of his neck tiredly. Back to business. He rolled his shoulders back and lifted his hand in a lazy wave at no one in particular. "See y'all later, brats." "What were you doing?" Sasuke demanded before Keiru could walk away. Keiru glanced over his shoulder at the Uchiha with a slight frown. "Don't get pissy, Uchiha," the taller genin commanded quietly. "You won, anyway." "That wasn't sparring," countered Sasuke. "You were." His eyebrows knitted together as he came to a realization. Teaching. Keiru had been forcing Sasuke to see his own mistakes. Whatever positions Sasuke had off, Keiru would correct by moving Sasuke's attacks. He had been teaching. That depends. A slow smile crossed Keiru's lips as he brushed the back of his hand against the corner of his mouth again. "Learn anything?" Before Sasuke could respond, Keiru turned away and started for the bridge, where the man in sunglasses was waiting for him. "Bye, Sakura-chan," the redhead called as he passed the three ninja beneath the tree. Sasuke slowly approached his team, still watching Keiru's back. How did Keiru know how good Sasuke was supposed to be? And why was the teenager presuming to teach him anyway? Nothing made sense about Naruto's new cousin. Naruto captured the lower of his lip in his mouth and frowned as he studied the people below him. He was perched on the edge of the flat roof that covered his apartment building, his legs dangling below him. He was tempted to get some water balloons or at least some spitballs to launch at unsuspecting victims' heads from his vantage point, but there were more important things at stake here than mere pranks. "What about that one?" Naruto pointed out a dark-haired man who looked about the same age as his companion. "What about him?" repeated Keiru in a patient tone. That was one thing that Naruto had quickly learned about his older cousin. Keiru was a good teacher. "He walks like Iruka-sensei." Naruto knitted his eyebrows together as he tried to find the words to describe what he saw. Hopefully, he looked up at Keiru, who sat in a similar position on the roof next to him. Right? Keiru nodded, pleased. Yep, he answered, then frowned at the man in plain clothes that Naruto had pointed out. I think he's a Junin. Yes. Naruto pumped one fist in the air triumphantly. After supper, and after Naruto had caught Keiru trying to repaint his seals without any aid and summarily had helped his cousin out, Keiru had dragged Naruto onto the roof. Literally, Naruto was going to ask how Keiru had managed to walk vertically up the side of the building, but first he had to finish this task. Keiru had challenged Naruto to point out all the people below them who were off-duty ninja. It was harder than Naruto thought, since the shinobi he was looking for didn't have any vests or hide to identify them. But he was determined to make Keiru proud. Hey, that guy's a ninja, too, right? Demanded Naruto. He's twitching. Well, that observation was obvious, at least. The man in question, maybe Kakashi's age, but it was hard to tell since Kakashi had all the hair of a 60-year-old man, was arguing with a younger man while his fingers rubbed together with a sense of regularity born of habit rather than rhythm. Twitching just means he's annoyed, Keiru announced after leaning forward to study Naruto's target. Use your eyes, Gaki. They're your best feature. At the sight of Keiru's happy smile, Naruto quickly leaned away from his blood relation. Ah, Keiru ni, he yelled, indignant. Don't say weird stuff like that. Keiru seemed to catch Naruto's meaning immediately as he waved his hands in front of him and frowned at Naruto the way Sakura did when her teammate said something wrong. That's not what I meant, Baka. Keiru snapped immediately. Keiru huffed and turned back to studying the street below them as Naruto shot him a dubious glare. But then Keiru's face fell into a solemn gaze over the village. Konoha has always had really strong eyes, Keiru noted. Mostly because of their dujutsu. Huh? Naruto hoped that this wasn't something he was supposed to know. Funny, though, his ignorance never seemed to bother Keiru like it did his teammates. They're Kekkei Genkei. Keiru turned to Naruto and explained simply. Bloodlines that are passed on through families. And they have to do with eyes. The Hyuga have the Byakugan. Hyuga? Naruto repeated. That was the name of that weird girl in Naruto's graduating class. The one that always looked like she had a fever. Like Hinata-chan? Keiru looked over at Naruto and nodded seriously. Yeah, he murmured. She's got a big clan for a family. It's not just her sister and her dad. Naruto cocked his head to the side slightly and thought. He had never seen Hinata with her family, but he thought that would be nice, to have a giant family to look out for. The other one's the Sharingan. Keiru's voice interrupted Naruto's ponderings for a moment. From Uchiha, Sasuke Teme? Naruto frowned. He's got a bloodline? His frown quickly fell into a sullen pout. It figured that the bastard had yet another advantage that Naruto didn't have. Why couldn't Naruto have some cool ability that would make even Sasuke jealous? Yeah, it used to be in all Uchiha, but now Sasuke's the only one left. Naruto frowned at Keiru, but the older boy was staring out over rooftops again with that serious gaze that Naruto suspected he used when he wasn't happy. His family was killed, ya no, Keiru suddenly announced, glancing from the corner of his eye at Naruto. Naruto blinked and quickly fell serious himself. Somewhere in his mind, he had registered the fact that Sasuke was alone, like him. But it wasn't something he thought of often. Usually, he was too busy trying to find some way to get Sasuke to acknowledge him. Is that why he's such a bastard? Naruto demanded with a grimace. I'm sure it's part of it, Keiru chuckled and leaned back, bracing his hands behind him. His face became thoughtful as he transferred his stare from the village to the darkening sky. It's hard, being alone. Naruto looked at his cousin and scowled at the expression on his face. Keiru would get that pained look sometimes. Mostly at night when he thought Naruto wasn't looking. But we're not alone anymore, Naruto declared firmly. He wasn't alone, and neither was Keiru. Keiru didn't have to be so sad anymore. Keiru turned his head to look at Naruto fully, a surprised stare taking the place of Keiru's pain. But then Keiru's face settled in a more subdued smile as he wrapped one arm behind Naruto, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. No, Naruto leaned into the arm behind him. Apparently the lesson was done for the night, but that was okay with Naruto. He was comfortable. Keiru leaned forward and gazed down at the street below them. He hummed to himself thoughtfully. We should have brought some spitballs up here or something. Naruto broke into a wide grin. Suddenly, he didn't care what kind of crazy eyes or blood whatever Sasuke had. Naruto had best big brother in Konoha. Keiru rolled his shoulders back as he stood just outside the Hokage's office, his mind still on the events of the previous day. For that brief time when he had been sparring first with Naruto then Sasuke, Keiru had felt like he was a part of Team 7 again. Except he didn't have the same connection to the others as he had with Naruto, just because the boy had immediately accepted him without question. Naruto was like that. His ability to see the good in everyone was one of the best things about him. It was also one of the first things Keiru had lost after the fall of Konoha. The others blamed it on the fact that Naruto held himself responsible for the whole mess. It was him that Akatsuki was after, so it was his fault. Easy enough logic. Personally, Keiru thought it had more to do with the fact that the fall of Konoha was the first time one of his own teammates had been killed. It hadn't been the first time Keiru had lost someone he considered his family, but it certainly had hurt the most. Suddenly, the doors to the Sandame's office opened, and Keiru was surprised to see 3 familiar genin march past him. "Stupid drunk doesn't think I'm a real ninja," the short blonde in front of Keiru muttered with his eyes narrowed dangerously at the floor in front of his feet. "Shut up, Dobi," commanded his dark teammate. Keiru watched the genin of Team 7 walk past him with a slight sense of amusement. They really needed to work on their observational skills. "Good morning, Keiru-kun." Kakashi, on the other hand, was a different matter. "Hey." Keiru just gave the man a lazy wave. He felt a bit like Shikamaru, but he was still unsure of what he was supposed to call the man who had taught him and didn't even know who he was. At the sound of his name, the 3 genin turned around to face the taller boy. "Hey, Keiru-ni," shouted Naruto enthusiastically. Keiru smiled at the sight. Sakura, feeling herself included in Keiru's good mood, smiled back and nodded a silent greeting to her teammate's relative. Sasuke merely took to staring at the redhead. Keiru wasn't sure if the Uchiha was glaring or just observing. But observing would probably be a good guess after Keiru had fought, or taught, Sasuke to within 1 punch yesterday. "Guess what?" Naruto demanded. "We finally got a cool mission. I'm so gonna kick ass. Just watch me, Ni-san." Keiru grinned. Oh, he was watching, all right. Stupid brats. The simple grumble was enough to snap Keiru's head around to face the older man who stood in the doorway, holding a half-drained sake jug in one hand. Keiru's eyes widened briefly then narrowed in realization. Naruto's first, cool mission, would also be the first time he saw someone die in front of his eyes. If you wanted someone stronger, you should have paid for a higher-ranked mission, OGG. Keiru folded his arms across his chest firmly. Tazuna's eyes widened nervously as he glanced at Keiru before he looked back at the genin team that was supposed to keep him and his bridge safe. Suddenly, Tazuna scoffed. "As long as they can get me to wave country in one piece," Tazuna began then trailed off. "Doesn't sound too hard." Keiru smirked at Tazuna's obvious discomfort. Then, the redhead noticed Kakashi's eye on him. He snapped his mouth shut suddenly. There was no reason for him to give Kakashi more reason to be suspicious of Keiru. However, if he could get Kakashi to be suspicious of Tazuna, maybe he would exercise a little more caution on this mission. Or maybe he had just made the man paranoid and Kakashi would drop the mission as soon as the Demon Brothers showed up. "Keiru-kun." Another voice from inside the office gained Keiru's immediate attention. He glanced past Tazuna to where Ebisu stood in front of Sarutobi's desk. Keiru gave both of the men a nervous smile before he entered the room, leaving Team 7 and their dubious C-ranked mission on the other side of the door. Sandame puffed at his pipe as Keiru entered the room with a slightly sheepish look. Over the days that Keiru had been living with Naruto and working as a Konoha genin, the Hokage had noticed more and more traits that the two boys seemed to share. They both had a healthy disrespect for authority, according to Ebisu. They both would look guilty when confronted by someone they did respect, such as Iruka or the Hokage himself. Either Naruto had some common personality traits with his cousin or Keiru was basing his performance as a spy on Naruto's behavior. Both were possibilities, but Sarutobi found himself wishing that the former would be the true reasoning. Hi, Hokage-sama," Keiru greeted the old man uncertainly. Hiruzen smiled around the stem of his pipe. The redhead's sheepish behavior was also something he had in common with Naruto. The old man supposed that a summons from the Hokage for no apparent reason was a bit intimidating, but he wanted to keep a close eye on the boy as well. "Good morning, Keiru-san." Sarutobi gave the young man a brief nod. "I have noticed that you have completed a number of missions competently. And Ebisu-san has commented on your hard work." "He has?" Keiru raised one eyebrow at the shinobi in sunglasses who stood in front of the Hokage. Sandame found Keiru's disbelief interesting. Ebisu had expressed his dislike of his assignment. Watching over Uzumaki Keiru prevented him from watching Sarutobi's honored grandson. But the Junin had noted that Keiru took all assignments without complaining and finished any task quickly. Plus, the Anbu that Sandame had charged with watching Keiru in his off-duty hours had reported nothing of significance. Keiru would take time to instruct Naruto when he could, but he rarely socialized with anyone else. "Perhaps a Chunin would be willing to take you as a partner or apprentice," suggested Sarutobi. With Keiru working as an apprentice, whoever his master was would have ample opportunity to observe the boy. Sandame was already considering several Junin he could ask to ply their trade as Chunin for this particular assignment. "What about Team 7? Keiru's suggestion cut into the Hokage's plans suddenly. He glanced over the young man and noted the way he kept one hand tucked into his pocket while the other gloved hand scratched at the back of his neck. "I kinda overheard the old man complaining as he left," Keiru explained with a jerk of his head towards the door behind him. "Maybe an additional older genin would help to reassure him, Hokage-sama." "You want to take the escort mission with Team 7? Confirmed Sandame." Keiru nodded and met the Hokage's eyes with a cerulean gaze. "A C-ranked mission would be better pay than just being an apprentice," Keiru noted. His eyes fell to the floor as he shrugged. "Besides, I haven't gotten to spend that much time with Naruto. With all the missions we both take." Sarutobi leaned back in his chair and exhaled a small puff of smoke. Keiru had a point about the pay. The general income of an apprentice would be conditional on how many missions he took. But the Hokage was more concerned about Keiru's other excuse. Sandame knew that Keiru spent every night with Naruto, sometimes even more of the day if Team 7 completed their missions early. The redhead could be using the escort mission as an excuse to get out of the village and spend some time with Naruto exclusively. But then again, Naruto was Keiru's only family here, if his story was to be believed, and it was natural that Keiru would want to get to know his cousin as much as possible. Keiru's most recent behavior also came into play. Kakashi had reported that Keiru had visited his team yesterday and started to spar with his genin. Hiruzen was less surprised with the fact that Keiru had been teaching Naruto than with Kakashi's report of the redhead's spar with Sasuke. Whether family or spy, Keiru would want Naruto to be stronger. But the spar with Sasuke made no sense to either possibility. If Keiru was a spy with the purpose of gaining the loyalty and strength of Konoha's Jinchuriki, why would the strength of the last Uchiha matter to him? On the other hand, given how much Naruto complained about Sasuke, why would Keiru want to help his cousin's rival? Putting Keiru on Team 7 temporarily could be a mistake, or it could be a rare chance to discover Keiru's intentions, especially if he was under the watchful eye of Sharingan Kakashi. Very well. Sandame made his decision. "I shall inform Kakashi to expect another member on his team tomorrow." Keiru broke into a genuine smile with a hint of relief behind it. This assignment was important to him. "Thank you, Hokage-sama." The older genin nodded briefly at the old man, a poor excuse for a bow, but one that was common for ninja who learned not to take their eyes off anyone who could whip a kunai from a holster in a second. Sarutobi nodded back as he watched the boy turn and leave. Danzo was right. He was getting soft in his old age. He truly wanted Keiru to be Naruto's family. He wanted Keiru to want Naruto to become strong for his own sake, not for the purpose of being a weapon. He wanted the village of Konoha to recognize Naruto for what he was. A young boy who carried a burden that he had had no choice in and yet burned with the will of fire that had shone so brightly in the Yondaime Hokage. Sarutobi Hiruzen opened his mouth and breathed out a ring of smoke towards the ceiling. Perhaps it was time to start thinking about retirement. Again. But first he had a Junin to summon to inform him of the slight change in the parameters of the escort mission he had just been assigned. That's all for now. If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments.